Hey guys, tonight we descend into the oldest written records of human civilization, where gods walked among mortals and wars between immortals reshaped the very fabric of reality. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Deep beneath the sands of modern Iraq lie clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks, cuneiform writing that predates the alphabet by thousands of years. These aren't fairy tales or primitive superstitions. They're the carefully preserved records of the Sumerian people, the first literate civilization known to history, and what they recorded challenges everything we think we know about the ancient world. The Sumerians emerged in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE, settling between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in a land they called the cradle of civilization. They invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, and complex legal systems. They built the first cities, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, monumental urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, when most of humanity still lived in scattered villages. These weren't primitive people scratching out survival, they were sophisticated, organized, and deeply spiritual, recording their history and beliefs with meticulous care on clay tablets that would survive millennia. Within these ancient texts lies a story that has fascinated and disturbed researchers for over a century. The story of the Anunnaki, the gods who descended from the heavens, who created humanity, who fought terrible wars among themselves, and whose final conflict may have ended their direct involvement with the world of mortals. The word Anunnaki itself derives from the Sumerian language, meaning something like those who from heaven came to earth, though translations vary. In the earliest texts they appear as the supreme council of deities, the great gods who determined the fates of both gods and humans. But who exactly were the Anunnaki according to the original Sumerian sources, not the modern interpretations or speculative theories, but what the ancient clay tablets actually say? The answer is far more complex and fascinating than most people realize. The Sumerian religious worldview is intensely hierarchical, mirroring their own city-state political structures. At the top sat An, sometimes called Anu, the supreme sky god and father of the pantheon. Below him stretched an elaborate network of deities, each with specific domains, responsibilities, and power levels. The Anunnaki were generally understood to be the 7 or sometimes 50 great gods who decree fates, the divine judges who sat in the cosmic assembly and determined the course of events in both heaven and earth. These weren't abstract philosophical concepts or metaphors for natural forces. To the Sumerians, these gods were as real as the kings who ruled their cities, perhaps more real because while kings died, the gods endured across generations. Every city had its patron deity who literally owned the city and its surrounding lands. The king was merely the god's earthly administrator, and temples weren't just places of worship, but the actual houses where the gods resided, ate, slept, and conducted their divine business. Priests fed the god statues daily, dressed them, and performed elaborate rituals to keep them content, because an angry god could destroy a city as easily as a human might crush an ant. The physical evidence of this civilization surrounds us still. The British Museum houses thousands of cuneiform tablets, rescued from Mesopotamian ruins. The Louvre displays massive winged bulls that once guarded Assyrian palaces. Universities across the world preserve fragments of epic poems, legal codes, astronomical observations, and commercial receipts, all painstakingly inscribed into wet clay and baked hard by the desert sun. When archaeologists first began excavating the tells, the artificial hills formed by millennia of human habitation in Iraq, they uncovered libraries containing thousands of tablets. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh alone yielded over 30,000 documents, many preserving copies of far older Sumerian texts. Deciphering these writings required generations of scholarly effort. The cuneiform script used wedge-shaped marks created by pressing a reed stylus into soft clay, and the same signs could represent different sounds or concepts depending on context. Early attempts at translation produced nonsense, but gradually, painfully, linguists cracked the code. They discovered that many Babylonian and Assyrian texts were copies or translations of even older Sumerian originals. The Sumerians had written in a language completely unrelated to any known language family, an isolate that shares no clear connections with Semitic, Indo-European or any other linguistic group. This isolation extends to their origins as a people. Unlike the Semitic Akkadians who would later dominate Mesopotamia, or the Indo-European peoples who migrated across Eurasia, the Sumerians seem to appear suddenly in the archaeological record, bringing with them fully formed cities, advanced agriculture, and sophisticated religious concepts. Where they came from remains one of archaeology's persistent mysteries. Their own legends speak of their gods teaching them the arts of civilization, of divine kings descending from heaven to rule in the antediluvian age before a great flood destroyed the world. Understanding the Anunnaki requires understanding Sumerian cosmology, their model of how reality itself was structured. The universe began in chaos, in the mixture of salt water and fresh water personified as the goddess Tiamat and the god Apsu. From their mingling came the first generation of gods, younger deities who were noisy and energetic, disturbing the primordial peace. This creation story, preserved most completely in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, but drawing on older Sumerian sources, describes a cosmos organized into distinct realms. Heaven belonged to An, the earth to Enlil, and the sweet waters beneath the earth to Enki. The underworld, the land of no return, fell under the dominion of Ereshkigal. The gods themselves were not immortal in the way we might imagine. They could be killed, though this was difficult, and they aged, albeit slowly. They required food and water, though of divine quality. They experienced emotions, lusts, jealousies, and ambitions just as humans did, only on a vastly larger scale. When gods fought, mountains shook and rivers ran backward. When they wept, their tears became storms. The boundary between divine and human wasn't absolute. Heroes like Gilgamesh could be 2/3 god and 1/3 man, and through great deeds a mortal might achieve divine status. This worldview permeated every aspect of Sumerian life. Agriculture followed the divine calendar established by the gods. Laws reflected divine justice as handed down from the heavens. Warfare between city-states was understood as conflict between patron deities, with human armies serving as proxies for their divine masters. When Lagash defeated Umma in battle, the Sumerian chronicles don't describe it as one city conquering another, but as the god Ningirsu defeating the god Shara, using human forces as instruments of divine will. The concept of divine warfare appears repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian literature, and these weren't abstract spiritual battles. The texts describe weapons, tactics, casualties, and consequences with the same concrete detail they apply to human conflicts. Gods wielded weapons that could shatter mountains, unleash floods, or rain fire from the sky. They commanded armies of lesser deities and divine servants. They besieged cosmic fortresses and engaged in single combat that reshaped the landscape. Understanding these divine conflicts is essential to understanding what happened during the Anunnaki's final war, because that conflict grew from tensions that had existed since the dawn of creation itself. The Sumerian king list, one of the most remarkable documents from ancient Mesopotamia, preserves the names of rulers extending back before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven and the gods themselves ruled the earth. These antediluvian kings supposedly reigned for impossibly long periods, 28,000 years, 36,000 years, durations that modern scholars interpret as mythical or symbolic. But the Sumerians recorded these figures with the same matter-of-fact precision they used for contemporary kings, whose reigns could be verified through multiple sources. To them, this wasn't myth but history, a record of the time when gods walked openly among humans and the distinction between heaven and earth was less absolute. Something changed. The texts speak of a great deluge that destroyed this earlier world, after which the gods reorganized their relationship with humanity. Kings still ruled by divine right, but the gods themselves withdrew to some degree, governing through intermediaries rather than direct presence. The nature of this change, and what caused it, forms the background to understanding the final war between the Anunnaki. But before we can explore that climactic conflict, we need to understand the players, the divine personalities whose ambitions, conflicts, and alliances would shape the destiny of both gods and mortals. Let us begin with the supreme deity, An or Anu, whose name simply means heaven in Sumerian. As the father of the gods and the ultimate source of legitimate divine authority, and occupied the highest position in the cosmic hierarchy. He resided in the highest heaven, far removed from the affairs of earth, intervening only in matters of supreme importance. His temple at Uruk, the Iana, was one of Mesopotamia's oldest and most important religious centers. Kings sought his blessing to legitimize their rule, and other gods acknowledged his supremacy, at least in theory. But An's power was more symbolic than active. Like a constitutional monarch, he reigned but did not govern directly. The actual administration of the cosmos fell to his children and grandchildren, particularly Enlil and Enki, whose rivalry would have profound consequences. An's consort Kai, the earth goddess, partnered with him in creating the first generation of great gods. Together they embodied the primal duality of heaven and earth, the cosmic marriage from which all other deities descended. Yet as civilization developed and religious concepts grew more complex, An's role became increasingly ceremonial while more dynamic gods seized practical power. The transfer of active authority from An to his sons mirrors political patterns visible throughout Mesopotamian history, where founding dynasties gave way to more capable or ruthless successors. The tablets describe assemblies of the gods where major decisions were debated and voted upon, a divine democracy of sorts, though weighted heavily towards the most powerful deities. And presided over these assemblies but rarely imposed his will unilaterally. This would become significant during the conflicts to come, because when the great gods went to war against each other, An often remained neutral, allowing his children to sort out their differences through force, rather than paternal intervention. Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Storm, inherited the most important practical authority in the pantheon. After An separated heaven from earth, Enlil received dominion over the atmosphere, the space between heaven and earth where weather occurred, where winds blew, where storms formed. This gave him control over agriculture, because rain determined whether crops flourished or failed. His temple at Nippur in central Mesopotamia served as the religious center of Sumer, the place where divine destinies were determined and cosmic decrees issued. Enlil's personality, as revealed through numerous myths and prayers, combined awesome power with volatile temperament. He could be benevolent, granting kingship to favored rulers and blessing cities with prosperity, but he could also be destructive, unleashing storms that devastated the land or, as we shall see, plotting to annihilate humanity entirely. The texts portray him as stern, demanding absolute obedience, quick to anger when his authority was challenged. His word was law in the divine council, and even other great gods hesitated to oppose him directly. Yet Enlil had a rival, his brother Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian sources, whose character and approach to governance differed dramatically. Where Enlil represented authority and order imposed from above, Enki embodied wisdom, craft, and clever solutions to problems. His domain was the Abzu, the sweet water beneath the earth that fed springs and rivers, and his temple at Eridu, the oldest city according to Sumerian tradition, honored him as the god of wisdom, magic, and creation. Enki loved humanity, or at least valued humans as useful creations, and repeatedly acted to protect mortals from Enlil's wrath. The tablets describe Enki as crafty, a trickster god who achieved through intelligence what others attempted through force. When Enlil sought to destroy humanity, Enki found loopholes in divine decrees to warn favored mortals. When problems arose requiring creative solutions, the other gods turned to Enki. He understood magic and possessed secret knowledge, the ME, the fundamental divine powers that governed reality itself. He could shapeshift, moving between forms as easily as water flows around obstacles. This flexibility made him unpredictable and to Enlil's orderly mind dangerous. The rivalry between Enlil and Enki extended beyond personality clash to fundamental philosophical differences about the proper relationship between gods and mortals. Enlil saw humans as servants created to relieve the gods of labor, expected to worship obediently and make offerings without complaint. When humans became too numerous and noisy, disturbing the gods' rest, Enlil's solution was simple: extermination. Enki viewed humans more favorably, perhaps because he participated directly in their creation, mixing clay with the blood of a slain god to form the first people. He taught humanity the arts of civilization, agriculture, writing, metalworking, and considered them worthy of preservation despite their flaws. This conflict appears repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian literature. In the Atrahasis epic, when Enlil sends plague, drought, and famine to reduce the human population, Enki teaches people how to survive each catastrophe. When Enlil finally decrees a universal flood to wipe out humanity entirely, Enki warns the hero Atrahasis, instructing him to build a boat and save his family along with animals and craftsmen. After the flood, when an enraged Enlil discovers that humans survived, it is Enki who negotiates a compromise, suggesting measures to control population growth without genocide. The tablets preserve this exchange between the brothers after the flood waters receded. Enlil, furious that his will was thwarted, confronts the assembly of gods demanding to know who revealed his plan. Enki doesn't deny his action, but argues that destroying all humanity was excessive, that the punishment should fit the crime. He proposes instead that some women be barren, that diseases carry off some children, that natural limits check population without extinction. Reluctantly, Enlil agrees to this compromise, establishing a new covenant with humanity. But the tension between the brothers remains, a fundamental disagreement about cosmic order that will resurface in future conflicts. Ninhursag, also known by many names including Ki, Ninmah, and Beletili, represented the divine feminine in its creative aspect. As Earth Mother and Birth Goddess, she partnered with Enki in creating humanity, shaping the clay while Enki provided the divine spark. Her relationship with both Enlil and Enki was complex. In some texts she appears as Enlil's consort, in others as Enki's partner in various castration endeavours. This multiplicity of roles and names reflects the syncretism common in Mesopotamian religion, where local goddesses were often identified with each other or absorbed into composite divine personalities. Ninhursag possessed particular concern for pregnancy, childbirth, and the nurturing of young life, both divine and human. Women in labour invoked her name, and her priestesses served as midwives and healers. But she could also be fierce when her domain was threatened. Several myths describe her anger when her creations were mistreated or her authority challenged. She participated in divine assemblies and her voice carried weight in cosmic decisions, though the patriarchal structure of Mesopotamian society meant male gods dominated the official hierarchy. The divine family tree extended far beyond these three primary figures. Inanna, later identified with the Akkadian Ishtar, was the goddess of love, war, and political power, perhaps the most popular deity in Mesopotamian worship. Her myths portray a complex contradictory personality, both nurturing and destructive, generous and vengeful. She descended into the underworld to challenge her sister Ereshkigal, triggering a crisis that threatened all life on Earth. She demanded worship from cities and destroyed those who refused her. Her sexual adventures with gods and mortals scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. Utu, the sun god, later called Shamash, embodied divine justice and truth, his all-seeing rays exposing wrongdoing and illuminating righteousness. He travelled across the sky each day and through the underworld each night, the only god with regular access to that dark realm. His judgment was sought in legal disputes, and his favour in commercial ventures, since his light made travel and trade possible. The Code of Hammurabi, one of history's earliest legal documents, shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, legitimizing human justice as reflection of divine order. Nanna, the moon god, also called Sin, ruled the night sky and the measurement of time. His phases marked the Mesopotamian calendar, determining when festivals occurred and when agricultural work should begin. His temple at Ur was among the most magnificent in Sumer, a massive ziggurat rising above the city like a mountain. Kings claimed to rule under his watchful eye, and astronomical priests carefully tracked his movements across the heavens. Ninurta, god of war and agriculture, represented martial prowess in service of cosmic order. His myths describe campaigns against chaotic forces, dragons and demons that threatened to overwhelm civilization. He defended his father Enlil's authority and served as the divine warrior par excellence, winning victories that other gods could not achieve. His weapons became legendary, magical artifacts of such power that possession of them conferred immense advantage in divine conflicts. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, governed the land of no return where the dead dwelt in eternal twilight. Her realm was sealed off from both heaven and earth. a prison from which even gods could not easily escape. When Inanna invaded her domain, Ereshkigal's power proved sufficient to kill even that mighty goddess, though Inanna was eventually resurrected through Enki's trickery. The underworld maintained its own hierarchy, its own rules, separate from but parallel to the cosmic order above. Beneath the great gods existed a vast bureaucracy of lesser deities, each with specific functions and limited domains. The Anunnaki in some texts referred specifically to these judges of the underworld, the 7 or 50 gods who decreed the fates of the dead. But in other contexts, Anunnaki designated all the great gods collectively, the entire divine council that governed the cosmos. This terminological confusion reflects the long evolution of Mesopotamian religion as concepts and titles shifted across centuries and between different city-states. More significant for our story is the class of deities called the Igigi. These were lesser gods assigned to manual labor, digging irrigation canals, working the fields of the great gods, performing the heavy tasks necessary to maintain the cosmos. According to the creation myths, the Igigi labored for countless years, growing increasingly resentful of their servitude. Finally, after 40 years of back-breaking work, they rebelled, burning their tools and marching on Enlil's temple to demand relief from their burden. This divine labor dispute created a crisis in heaven. Enlil wanted to crush the rebellion by force, but Enki proposed an alternative solution: create a new race of beings to take over the work. Beings intelligent enough to farm and build but mortal and therefore manageable. Thus, humanity was created not from divine benevolence, but from practical necessity, to replace the striking Igigi gods as the workforce maintaining creation. The tablets specify that humans were formed from clay mixed with the blood and flesh of a slain god, giving them intelligence and some measure of divine nature, but remaining fundamentally mortal. This origin story explains much about the Mesopotamian view of humanity's purpose. People existed to serve the gods through labor, worship, and offerings. The entire temple economy was predicated on this understanding. Vast estates belonging to the gods required cultivation, and the harvest fed both the priesthood and the divine images themselves. Failure to maintain this service could provoke divine anger, as when Enlil complained that humans multiplied so rapidly they disturbed the gods' rest with their noise. The creation of humanity solved one problem, but it created others. The Igigi were freed from labor, but humans proved unpredictable. They bred rapidly, spreading across the earth, building their own cities, developing their own ambitions. Some humans achieved such power and prestige that they threatened to blur the line between mortal and divine. The antediluvian kings, ruling for thousands of years, began to resemble gods themselves. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, performed feats that challenged the god's unique status. This tension between divine and mortal realms underlies many Mesopotamian myths. The gods created humans to serve them, but feared human potential for independence. They wanted worship, but worried about competition. They demanded obedience, but their own nature was contentious and competitive. The divine council itself was not harmonious, but fractious, with gods forming alliances, plotting against rivals, and pursuing personal ambitions that sometimes conflicted with cosmic stability. Understanding this divine society, with all its complexity and internal contradictions, is essential to understanding what happened during the Anunnaki's final war. This wasn't a conflict between clearly defined good and evil forces, but a multifaceted power struggle involving ancient grudges, philosophical differences, competing claims to authority, and the question of what role, if any, humanity should play in cosmic affairs. The war didn't begin suddenly, but built gradually from tensions that had existed since the creation of the world. Before examining the final conflict itself, we need to explore the earlier wars and conflicts that established patterns and precedents. The Mesopotamian texts preserve accounts of several major divine conflicts, each offering clues about how gods fought wars, what weapons they used, what was at stake, and how conflicts were resolved or left festering. These earlier wars set the stage for the ultimate showdown between the Anunnaki. The most famous divine war in Mesopotamian literature is the conflict between Marduk and Tiamat, preserved in the Babylonian creation epic Enuma Elish. This text, composed sometime in the late 2nd millennium BCE, drew on older Sumerian sources while promoting Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, to supremacy over the traditional Sumerian pantheon. The story begins with Tiamat, the primordial ocean goddess, and Apsu, the freshwater god, existing in undifferentiated chaos before creation. From their mingling came the first generation of gods, noisy young deities whose activity disturbed the primordial peace. Apsu complained to Tiamat that he could not rest because of the younger gods' disturbance. He proposed destroying them, returning to the original silence. Tiamat resisted this solution, reluctant to destroy her own offspring, but Apsu determined to proceed regardless. Word of his plan reached the younger gods, causing panic among them. Enki, wisest of the young gods, devised a plan to save his generation. Through magic he cast a spell of sleep upon Apsu, then killed him while he slumbered, establishing his temple over Apsu's corpse. This murder of the primordial father god violated the most fundamental cosmic order, but Enki faced no immediate consequences. Instead, he claimed Apsu's domain and established himself as god of the sweet waters and wisdom. For a time an uneasy peace prevailed. But Tiamat, though initially reluctant to destroy the younger gods, eventually sought revenge for her consort's murder. Urged on by her vizier, she raised an army of monsters and elder gods who remembered the old ways. The tablets describe her forces in terrifying detail: serpents with venom for blood, dragons bristling with terror, storm demons, fishmen, scorpion men, and other creatures that combined features of different animals in nightmarish configurations. She appointed one of the elder gods, Kingu, as her champion and general, giving him the Tablet of Destinies, the artifact that granted ultimate authority over cosmic fate. Against this army of chaos, the younger gods were paralyzed with fear. None dared face Tiamat in battle. Anu attempted to confront her, but turned back when he saw her terrifying host. Ea likewise refused the challenge. The younger gods seemed doomed until Marduk, son of Enki, offered to champion their cause. But he set a price for his service. If he defeated Tiamat, the other gods must recognize him as king of the gods, with supreme authority over the entire pantheon. Desperate, the Divine Council agreed to Marduk's terms. They granted him unmatched weapons, a bow and arrows, a mace, lightning, and the 7 winds. They gave him a net woven from the 4 winds to trap his enemy. Most significantly, they granted him the power of the word, that his commands would shape reality itself. Armed with these divine weapons and newfound authority, Marduk rode forth in his storm chariot to face Tiamat in single combat. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat represents cosmic conflict on the largest scale. When they met, Marduk challenged Tiamat to single combat rather than army against army. She accepted, and they engaged in a duel that reshaped creation itself. Marduk sent the evil winds into Tiamat's face, causing her to open her mouth in rage. He shot an arrow down her throat, piercing her heart and killing her. Then, in an act of supreme dominance, he split her corpse in half like a shellfish, using one half to create the sky and the other to create the earth. From Tiamat's eyes, he made the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow. From her tail he fashioned the mountains. Her ribs became the vault of heaven. The tablets describe this creative act in detail, showing how Marduk took the forces of chaos and organized them into cosmos, imposing order on primordial disorder. This wasn't just military victory, but cosmogonic triumph, the establishment of the ordered world from the body of defeated chaos. After defeating Tiamat, Marduk turned his attention to her army. He captured the rebel gods and bound them in chains. He seized the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu and placed it on his own breast, legitimizing his claim to cosmic supremacy. The other gods, witnessing his victory, confirmed their promise and proclaimed him king. They built him Babylon as his earthly seat, a city that would become the center of Mesopotamian civilization for centuries. But Marduk's victory created a problem. What to do with the defeated rebel gods? Killing them all would deplete the divine population, but leaving them alive risked future rebellion. Enki, Marduk's father, proposed a solution. They would execute Kingu, whose blood would be mixed with clay to create humanity. Thus humans would inherit some divine nature from their origin in divine blood, while remaining fundamentally mortal and subordinate. This creation of humanity from the blood of a defeated rebel god established mortals as permanent servants to the victorious gods. The Enuma Elish presents this as the foundation of cosmic order. with Marduk as the rightful king of gods and humans, created specifically to serve the divine hierarchy. But it's important to recognize that this text emerged from Babylon at the height of its political power. The elevation of Marduk over traditional Sumerian deities like Enlil represented Babylonian political triumph as much as religious revelation. Earlier Sumerian texts give Enlil the role Marduk claims here, suggesting that divine hierarchies shifted with political power. This pattern of victorious gods revising cosmic history to justify their supremacy appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature. Each major city promoted its patron deity's importance, sometimes claiming roles for that god that other cities attributed to different deities. The resulting confusion of divine roles and hierarchy reflects the fractured political landscape of Mesopotamia, where competing city-states each claimed divine authority for their own independence and ambitions. The Tiamat War established several important precedents for understanding divine conflict. First, wars between gods could literally reshape reality, creating new cosmic structures from the bodies of defeated enemies. Second, divine weapons possessed powers beyond anything mortals could wield, from arrows that never missed their target to words that commanded reality itself. Third, victory in divine combat conferred legitimate authority, the right to rule acknowledged even by former opponents. Fourth, divine conflicts could be resolved through single combat between champions rather than requiring total warfare. But most significantly, the Tiamat myth showed that the cosmos emerged from violence, not peaceful creation. Order came through the defeat of chaos, through imposing structure on resistant material. This understanding of creation through conflict permeated Mesopotamian thought. Kings justified their wars by comparing themselves to Marduk, defeating Tiamat. Priests performed rituals reenacting the creation battle to ensure cosmic order continued. The annual New Year festival in Babylon included dramatic performances of the Enuma Elish, reminding both gods and humans of the foundations of civilized order. Yet this violent foundation contained seeds of future conflicts. If Marduk gained supremacy through victory over Tiamat, might another god claim that same supremacy by defeating Marduk? If the Tablet of Destinies granted ultimate authority to whoever possessed it, wouldn't ambitious gods constantly scheme to steal it? Indeed, several myths describe attempts to seize the Tablet of Destinies, each potentially capable of triggering cosmic crisis. The Anzu bird, a divine creature serving the gods, once stole the Tablet of Destinies while Enlil was bathing, plunging the cosmos into chaos. Without the tablet, Enlil's commands carried no weight. Divine order itself became unstable. The gods called upon Ninurta to recover the tablet, and only after a terrible aerial battle did Ninurta defeat Anzu and restore the tablet to Enlil. This myth demonstrates the fragility of cosmic order, dependent on possession of physical artifacts that could be stolen or lost. Another major divine conflict preserved in the texts involves Inanna's descent to the underworld, an incident that nearly destroyed all life on Earth. Inanna, goddess of love and war, decided to visit the underworld realm of her sister Ereshkigal, ostensibly to attend the funeral rites of Ereshkigal's husband. But the real purpose seems to have been either curiosity or ambition. The underworld was the one realm where Inanna's power did not extend, and her competitive nature may have driven her to challenge even death itself. Ereshkigal, suspicious of her sister's motives, allowed Inanna to enter but imposed conditions. At each of the 7 gates leading down into the underworld, Inanna had to remove one of her divine regalia: her crown, her necklace, her robe, her staff, each item representing an aspect of her power. By the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne room, Inanna was naked and powerless, stripped of all divine authority. Ereshkigal immediately killed her and hung her corpse on a hook like meat in a butcher shop. Inanna's death created catastrophe in the world above. As goddess of fertility and love, her absence meant no crops grew, no animals mated, no humans felt desire. Life itself began to fail, sliding toward universal sterility. The other gods, realizing the crisis, appealed to Enki for help. Once again, the wise god devised a solution through trickery rather than force. He created 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, genderless creatures who could enter the underworld without triggering its laws. These beings carried food and water of life, and they descended to the realm of death. They found Ereshkigal in labour, giving birth in agony. Showing her sympathy, they eased her suffering, and in gratitude she offered them any gift. They requested Inanna's corpse, which Ereshkigal reluctantly granted. Sprinkling the corpse with the food and water of life, they resurrected Inanna. But the laws of the underworld decreed that no one could leave without providing a substitute. Demons accompanied Inanna back to the surface, seeking someone to take her place in Death's realm. Inanna searched for an appropriate substitute, rejecting various loyal servants and priestesses who mourned her absence. Finally, she arrived at her own city, Uruk, where her consort Dumuzi sat on a throne, dressed in fine garments showing no sign of grief. Enraged that he did not mourn her, Inanna designated him as her substitute. The demons seized Dumuzi and dragged him to the underworld despite his desperate attempts to escape. Eventually a compromise was reached. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld while his sister Geshti Inanna spent the other half, allowing each to experience both life and death in turn. This myth reveals the ruthless side of the gods, even those generally considered beneficent. Inanna condemned her own consort to death out of wounded pride. Ereshkigal killed her sister without hesitation. The underworld itself operated by implacable laws that even the greatest gods could not easily override. Divine power had limits, boundaries beyond which even gods could not safely venture. These limits would prove significant in the conflicts to come. The pattern repeats across Mesopotamian mythology, gods competing for power, status and authority, sometimes cooperating but often conflicting, bound by laws and customs that limited even divine freedom. The Me, the fundamental divine powers, were finite and could be stolen or transferred. Inanna famously got Enki drunk and tricked him into giving her numerous Me, divine powers that she then brought to her city of Uruk, enhancing its prestige and her own authority. Enki, sobering up and realizing what he'd done, tried to send demons to reclaim the Me, but Inanna had already reached Uruk and established them there. These stories portray gods as fundamentally similar to humans, only vastly more powerful. They felt jealousy, anger, lust, and ambition. They made mistakes and suffered consequences. They could be tricked, defeated, or killed. This anthropomorphic conception of divinity makes Mesopotamian religion more relatable but also more disturbing, because gods who behave like humans, only with cosmic power, can inflict catastrophic harm when their conflicts escalate beyond control. The relationship between Enlil and Enki, the two brothers who shared authority over the organized cosmos, contained particular potential for catastrophic conflict. From the earliest texts, their approaches to governance differed fundamentally. Enlil demanded obedience and maintained order through authority and, when necessary, force. Enki preferred clever solutions and manipulation, achieving his goals through indirect means. This philosophical difference extended to their views on humanity. When the Igigi gods rebelled against their labor, threatening cosmic stability, Enlil wanted to suppress the revolt by force. Enki proposed creating humans to replace the divine workers, a solution that addressed the underlying problem rather than just its symptoms. Similarly, when humanity multiplied and became noisy, disturbing the gods' rest, Enlil's initial solution was plague and famine to reduce the population. When humans recovered from each catastrophe, he escalated to proposing complete extermination through flood. Enki consistently opposed these measures, protecting humanity and teaching people how to survive Enlil's attacks. The Atrahasis epic, one of the longest and most detailed Akkadian texts, preserves the fullest account of this conflict. After creating humans from clay mixed with divine blood, the gods expected grateful service. For 1,200 years humanity performed as designed, working the fields, building temples and making offerings. But humans, being mortal, reproduced rapidly. The earth filled with people and their constant noise disturbed Enlil's sleep. Enlil brought the problem before the divine council. The tablets record his complaint. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar I am deprived of sleep. His solution was simple. Send plague to reduce their numbers. The council agreed, and disease swept across the earth, killing enormous numbers of people. For a time the world was quiet again. But humans recovered, populations rebounded, and soon the noise returned. Enlil tried again, this time sending drought. No rain fell for 7 years. Crops failed, famine spread, and once more human numbers declined dramatically. But Enki taught the remaining humans how to drill wells, how to find water underground, how to irrigate their fields from springs and rivers. Slowly, humanity recovered again. Enlil attempted more subtle approaches, reducing human fertility, increasing infant mortality, establishing barren women as a natural check on population. Each measure had some effect, but none solved what Enlil considered the fundamental problem. Humans existed in numbers sufficient to disturb divine peace. After 1,200 years more, Enlil reached his final conclusion. Humanity must be destroyed utterly, eliminated so completely that the noise could never return. He proposed unleashing a universal flood, a deluge so vast it would drown every living thing on Earth. The Divine Council debated this extreme measure, but Enlil's authority carried the decision. The gods swore an oath to keep the plan secret from humanity, ensuring no warning could allow humans to prepare. This oath bound even Enki, who opposed the genocide, but could not openly violate divine consensus without triggering war among the gods themselves. Enki, however, found a loophole. The oath prevented him from telling humans directly about the coming flood, but it said nothing about speaking to walls or other inanimate objects. Enki went to the reed house of his devoted follower Atrahasis and spoke to the wall. Knowing Atrahasis would overhear, he described the coming catastrophe and gave detailed instructions for building a boat to survive it. He specified the dimensions, the materials, the supplies to bring, even the pitch to make it waterproof. Atrahasis obeyed, building the boat exactly as instructed and loading it with his family, craftsmen, animals, and supplies. When the flood came, it came with apocalyptic fury. The tablets describe 7 days and nights of continuous rain, the sluice gates of heaven opening, the fountains of the deep bursting forth, water rising until it covered the mountains. Every living thing on earth drowned except those aboard Atrahasis's boat. Even the gods were terrified by the flood's intensity, cowering like dogs against the outer wall of heaven. The description of divine reaction to the flood reveals unexpected vulnerability. The gods, having decreed humanity's destruction, apparently didn't anticipate how much they would miss human worship and offerings. Without humans to feed them, to maintain their temples, to perform rituals, the gods went hungry. The tablets describe them gathering around sacrifices like flies, desperate for offerings. Enki's warning proved prescient. Destroying all humans would leave the gods without servants, defeating the very purpose for which humanity was created. When the flood receded and Atrahasis emerged from the boat offering sacrifices to the gods, Enlil discovered that humans had survived. His fury was terrible. He demanded to know who had violated the divine oath, who had warned mortals of the coming deluge. Enki, standing before the assembly, didn't deny his action but defended it with careful arguments. Punish the sinner for his sin, he suggested, and the righteous for his righteousness, but do not destroy all mankind for the faults of some. Moreover, he pointed out, the gods needed humans, who would maintain the temples, who would provide offerings, who would perform the labor that kept the cosmos functioning. The Divine Council, hungry and sobered by the flood's intensity, reconsidered. Enlil reluctantly accepted that complete extermination had been excessive. A compromise was reached. Humans would continue to exist, but measures would limit their numbers. Some women would be barren, some infants would die, diseases would carry off some people. Population would be checked without requiring total destruction. Atrahasis and his family would repopulate the earth, and humanity would continue, but under stricter divine oversight. This compromise did not resolve the underlying tension between Enlil and Enki. It merely papered over their fundamental disagreement about humanity's value and rights. Enlil viewed humans as tools, useful but ultimately disposable if they became troublesome. Enki saw humans as creations worthy of protection, beings with potential beyond mere servitude. This philosophical divide would resurface in future conflicts, each crisis forcing the question, did gods exist to be served by humanity, or did humans have inherent value beyond their service to divine masters? The flood narrative exists in multiple versions across Mesopotamian literature. The Sumerian version features Ziusudra as the flood hero. The Akkadian Atrahasis is most detailed. The Epic of Gilgamesh incorporates the flood story as one episode, with Utnapishtim as the survivor who achieves immortality. Later, the biblical flood narrative drew heavily on these Mesopotamian sources, with Noah playing the role of the divinely warned survivor. The similarities between the biblical and Mesopotamian accounts are too extensive for coincidence, suggesting cultural transmission of the story across civilizations. But in the original Mesopotamian versions, the flood was not divine punishment for human sin, but simply a noise complaint that escalated to genocide. The gods were not morally superior beings, but powerful entities with their own agendas, capable of terrible decisions. Enki was not perfectly good, but merely more sympathetic to humans than Enlil. The moral landscape was complex, without clear heroes and villains, only competing interests and perspectives. Understanding this moral complexity is essential for understanding the final war between the Anunnaki. This wasn't a simple battle between good and evil forces, but a multifaceted conflict involving ancient grudges, competing claims to authority, different visions of cosmic order, and fundamentally incompatible approaches to governance. The flood demonstrated that when divine conflicts escalated beyond control, the consequences could threaten all existence, divine and mortal alike. After the flood, a new pattern emerged in divine-human relations. The age of direct divine rule ended. No longer did gods walk openly among humans as kings. Instead, they governed through mortal intermediaries, establishing the institution of sacred kingship. Kings claimed to rule by divine right, appointed by the gods and answerable to them, but clearly human and mortal. This transition marked a withdrawal of direct divine presence from the world, a change whose causes and implications the texts explore in various ways. The Sumerian king list, one of the strangest documents from ancient Mesopotamia, records this transition explicitly. It begins with kingship descending from heaven, and lists 8 or 10 antediluvian kings who ruled for impossibly long periods before the flood destroyed the world. After the flood, it states, kingship descended from heaven again, but the post-flood kings ruled for more normal lifespans, though still longer than ordinary humans. Gradually over generations, royal lifespans approached normal human duration, suggesting a progressive distancing between divine and mortal realms. Several explanations for this divine withdrawal appear in the texts. Some myths suggest the gods tired of direct involvement with humanity, finding humans too troublesome to manage closely. Others imply the gods feared human potential, that humans might achieve such power as to threaten to divine supremacy. The story of the Tower of Babel, though biblical, likely draws on Mesopotamian sources describing humanity's attempt to build a tower reaching heaven, an ambition the gods thwarted by confusing human languages and scattering people across the earth. The ziggurat temples of Mesopotamia represent humanity's continued effort to bridge the gap between earth and heaven. These massive stepped pyramids, with temples on their summits, served as staircases for the gods to descend and for priests to ascend, creating meeting points between divine and mortal worlds. The ziggurat at Babylon, probably the inspiration for the Tower of Babel story, was called a Temenanki, meaning house of the foundation of heaven and earth, explicitly claiming to connect the two realms. But even with ziggurat temples facilitating divine human contact, the gods no longer walked among mortals as they once did. Divine appearances became special events rather than everyday occurrences. Gods communicated through omens, dreams, and prophetic visions rather than direct speech. This increased distance created new problems, because without direct divine presence, how could humans know what the gods wanted? How could cities be certain their patron deity approved of their actions? Divination emerged as the primary means of discerning divine will. Priests examined sheep livers, observed celestial phenomena, interpreted dreams, and analyzed coincidences, seeking patterns that revealed divine intentions. Entire libraries of omen texts accumulated, cataloguing observations. If the liver has such and such appearance, it means the king will triumph in battle, or if Mars appears in a certain constellation, flood will destroy the crops. This elaborate system of divination reflected anxiety about the gods' intentions and the desperate need to understand divine will in the absence of direct communication. Sacred kingship provided another channel for divine human interaction. The king served as intermediary between gods and people, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual, just governance, and military defense of the realm. New Year festivals included elaborate ceremonies where the king underwent ritual humiliation and renewal, symbolically dying and being reborn, reenacting cosmic cycles of death and resurrection. The king's performance of these rituals supposedly ensured fertility, prosperity, and divine blessing for the coming year. Yet even kings were mortal, subject to disease, aging, and death. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of world literature's earliest masterpieces, explores the tragedy of mortality from a king's perspective. Gilgamesh, 2/3 god and 1/3 man, was the mightiest king of Uruk, performing heroic deeds that rivaled divine exploits. But when his companion Enkidu died, Gilgamesh confronted his own mortality with existential terror. He embarked on a quest to find immortality, travelling to the edge of the world seeking Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who achieved eternal life. Gilgamesh's journey took him through fantastic landscapes: the Garden of the Gods with jeweled trees, the tavern at the edge of the world, the waters of death that no mortal could cross. He braved dangers that would destroy ordinary humans, driven by desperate determination to escape death's inevitability. Finally reaching Utnapishtim, Gilgamesh demanded the secret of immortality. Utnapishtim's answer was crushing. "There is no permanence," he said. "Death is inevitable for mortals, and even gods are not truly immortal. The best humans can hope for is to live well, accomplish great deeds, and be remembered." Utnapishtim did reveal the existence of a plant that could restore youth, growing at the bottom of the cosmic ocean. Gilgamesh dove deep and retrieved it, planning to bring it back to Uruk and share it with the city's elders. But while he bathed in a pool, a serpent smelled the plant's sweet fragrance and ate it, shedding its skin and stealing the gift of renewed youth. Gilgamesh returned to Uruk empty-handed. His quest for immortality failed. The epic ends with him contemplating the great walls he had built, finding solace in the permanence of his city and works even though his body must eventually die. The Gilgamesh epic, though focused on human mortality, illuminates divine nature as well. The gods in this story are capricious, sending Enkidu to die because he offended Ishtar by rejecting her sexual advances. Divine justice seems arbitrary, divine favour unreliable. Even Shamash, the sun god who generally supports Gilgamesh, cannot prevent Enkidu's death once the divine council has decreed it. The gods possess power but not perfect control, subject themselves to fate's decrees and cosmic laws they cannot override. This limited divine power becomes crucial to understanding the final war between the Anunnaki. If gods were truly omnipotent, conflicts between them would be impossible. One would simply overpower the others. But Mesopotamian gods, while vastly more powerful than humans, had limits. They could be defeated, wounded, even killed under the right circumstances. They depended on worship and offerings for sustenance. They were bound by oaths and cosmic laws. These limitations meant divine conflicts could be genuine struggles whose outcomes were not predetermined. The transition from the age of direct divine rule to the age of sacred kingship represented more than an organizational change. It reflected deeper shifts in the cosmic order, changes in how gods and humans related to each other. Some texts suggest this distancing was voluntary, that the gods chose to withdraw from direct involvement with humanity. Others imply it was forced, that events during or after the flood changed the cosmic structure in ways that made direct divine presence on Earth difficult or impossible. One intriguing theory emerging from careful textual analysis suggests the final war between the Anunnaki occurred during this transition period. The war's outcome might have been precisely this separation between divine and mortal realms, the withdrawal of direct divine presence from Earth. If so, understanding the war requires examining not just mythological battles, but historical transitions, the archaeological evidence of catastrophic changes in Mesopotamian civilization during specific periods. The Late Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BCE, saw the destruction of numerous civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Cities were burned, populations displaced, trade networks collapsed. The causes remain debated. Climate change, earthquakes, invasions by the mysterious sea peoples, internal rebellions, or some combination of factors. But Mesopotamian texts from this period describe it in terms of divine abandonment, gods leaving their cities, cosmic order breaking down. The lamentation texts, a genre of Sumerian literature describing the destruction of cities, portray these catastrophes as consequences of divine decisions. The gods, for reasons not always explained, chose to abandon their cities to destruction. In the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, the goddess Ningal pleads with the divine council to spare her city, but the decision has been made, and an Enlil decrees Ur's destruction, and despite Ningal's tears, the city falls to foreign invaders and is burnt to the ground. These lamentation texts describe destruction in vivid, terrible detail. Bodies pile in the streets, temples burn, walls crumble. Foreign soldiers loot and massacre. Survivors are led away as captives. The gods themselves weep for their ruined cities but do not intervene to prevent the destruction. This raises disturbing questions. Why would gods allow their own cities to be destroyed? Why abandon people who had served them faithfully? What cosmic crisis could force even the great gods to withdraw protection from their worshippers? One possible answer involves changes in divine hierarchy and the consolidation of power in Babylon under Marduk. As Babylon rose to political supremacy in Mesopotamia, its patron god Marduk's status rose correspondingly. The Enuma Elish, composed during this period, promoted Marduk to king of the gods, superseding Enlil's traditional supremacy. This religious revolution didn't happen peacefully. It represented the victory of Babylonian political power over the older Sumerian city-states, and religious texts from this period suggest significant divine conflict. Marduk's elevation required subordinating the traditional Sumerian deities, particularly Enlil. How would Enlil, who had ruled the pantheon for millennia, react to being superseded by his grandson? The tablets preserve hints of conflict. Some texts describe Enlil accepting Marduk's supremacy graciously, handing over the tablet of destinies voluntarily. Others suggest more contentious transfer of power, with Marduk seizing authority rather than receiving it peacefully. The question of legitimacy haunted Marduk's claim to kingship of the gods. Enlil's authority derived from An, the original Sky Father. Marduk's came from his victory over Tiamat and subsequent divine acclamation. But victories can be reversed. If another god defeated Marduk, would that god gain supremacy? This uncertainty kept the divine hierarchy unstable, with ambitious gods always potentially threatening the established order. Assyria, Babylon's great rival in northern Mesopotamia, promoted its own patron deity Ashur to supreme status, creating competing claims to divine kingship. Assyrian texts describe Ashur performing the same cosmic deeds attributed to Marduk elsewhere, defeating chaos and establishing order. When Assyria conquered Babylon, they took the statue of Marduk back to Assyria as a war trophy, symbolically subordinating the Babylonian god to Ashur. Later, when Babylon regained independence, they brought Marduk's statue back triumphantly, restoring his proper supremacy. These conflicting theological claims reflected political realities, but also suggested genuine divine conflicts. If different gods claimed supreme authority, eventually those claims would need to be resolved through force. The Mesopotamian texts preserve accounts of what might be called civil wars among the gods, conflicts between factions of the pantheon supporting different claimants to authority or pursuing incompatible goals. One such conflict involved the Emi, the fundamental divine powers that governed reality. Inanna's theft of the Emi from Enki, mentioned earlier, nearly triggered war. Enki sent demons to reclaim the stolen powers, but Inanna's servant fought them off, allowing Inanna to reach Uruk and establish the Emi there permanently. Enki, for reasons not entirely clear, accepted this outcome rather than escalating to open war, but the incident demonstrated how conflicts over divine powers could bring gods to the brink of catastrophic confrontation. The Mi themselves represent an interesting concept with no exact equivalent in modern religious thought. They were not abstract principles, but concrete, transferable powers that governed specific aspects of reality. Kingship was a Mi, as were craftsmanship, sexual intercourse, warfare, music, writing, and hundreds of other fundamental functions. Gods possessed these powers but could lose them through theft, trickery, or defeat in combat. Whoever controlled the Mi controlled the corresponding aspect of reality. This means divine power was not intrinsic but dependent on possession of these cosmic artifacts and authorities. A god stripped of their Mi would lose their domain and influence. This vulnerability created constant anxiety among the gods and constant temptation to steal powers from rivals. The tablets describe numerous incidents of gods losing their me temporarily and desperately seeking to recover them before other deities exploited their weakness. Understanding the me is crucial to understanding divine warfare in Mesopotamian thought. Wars between gods weren't just displays of power, but struggles for control over cosmic functions. When Marduk defeated Tiamat, he didn't just kill an enemy, but seized control over the primordial powers she embodied. When Ninurta recovered the Tablet of Destinies from the Anzu bird, he preserved the cosmic order that would collapse without the tablet's authority. Divine warfare had existential stakes, potentially rewriting the fundamental structure of reality. Against this background of divine competition, shifting hierarchies and existential insecurity, we can begin to understand how tensions could escalate toward a final, catastrophic war between the Anunnaki. The gods were not unified but fractious, not secure but anxious, not immortal but vulnerable. Their conflicts were not abstract but concrete, with real consequences for cosmic order and human civilization. When the final war came, it would draw on all these accumulated tensions, ancient grudges, and incompatible claims to authority. Before examining that final conflict directly, we need to understand the weapons and powers the gods wielded in combat. Mesopotamian texts describe divine warfare with remarkable specificity, detailing weapons, tactics, and consequences. These aren't vague mythological symbols, but concrete descriptions that reveal how the ancient Mesopotamians imagined cosmic conflict actually occurring. The weapons of the gods combined natural forces with crafted artifacts in ways that blurred the line between technology and magic. Enlil wielded storms as weapons, unleashing floods and hurricanes against enemies. Ishtar commanded the powers of both love and war, able to inspire devastating passion or martial fury. Ninurta possessed a talking mace that provided tactical advice during battle, and weapons that could shatter mountains. Marduk controlled the four winds and rode a storm chariot that moved faster than thought. But beyond natural forces, gods used manufactured weapons of terrible power. The texts describe divine bows that never missed their target, arrows that could pierce any armor, nets that could capture even immortal beings, swords that cut through any substance, shields that deflected any attack, armor that made wearers invulnerable. These weapons were forged by divine craftsmen using materials and techniques beyond human knowledge, imbued with cosmic powers through secret rituals. Some weapons sound almost technological in description. Ninurta's Sharur, his talking mace, could fly independently to scout enemy positions and report back. The texts describe it as having wings and the ability to speak, characteristics that have led some modern interpreters to speculate about ancient advanced technology rather than magical artifacts. Similarly, Marduk's net woven from the four winds has been interpreted variously as a mystical restraint, or as some form of energy weapon. The most significant divine weapon was arguably the Tablet of Destinies, mentioned repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian texts. This artifact granted its possessor the authority to decree fates that would inevitably come to pass. Commands issued while holding the tablet became reality itself, shaping cosmic order according to the speaker's will. Possession of the tablet conferred legitimate authority over the pantheon, which is why its theft triggered immediate crisis and recovery efforts. The me, mentioned earlier, functioned somewhat like weapons, in that controlling them gave gods power over specific aspects of reality. But unlike weapons designed to destroy, the me enabled creation and governance. A god who possessed the me of kingship could appoint kings and establish dynasties. One who controlled the me of war could grant victory to chosen armies. The me of craftsmanship enabled creation of wondrous artifacts. Together, the hundreds of different me constituted the operating system of reality, the fundamental code that made cosmos possible. Divine combat tactics reflected these powers. When gods fought, they didn't merely trade blows but attempted to strip each other of cosmic authority, to steal me and seize control over each other's domains. Victory meant not just defeating an enemy but absorbing their powers and territories, expanding the victor's cosmic influence. Defeat could mean reduction to impotence, stripped of me and authority, forced to serve the conqueror or retreat into obscurity. The tablets preserve accounts of single combat between divine champions, similar to the Marduk-Tiamat battle. When gods faced each other directly, their combat reshaped the landscape. Mountains crumbled, rivers changed course, deserts formed where forests once grew. The physical evidence of divine battles supposedly remained visible in the world's geography, with unusual rock formations or barren wastelands explained as scars from ancient cosmic wars. But gods could also wage war through proxies, using mortal armies as instruments of divine will. The constant warfare between Mesopotamian city-states was understood in this framework, with human conflicts reflecting divine rivalries. When Lagash defeated Umma, it was because Ningirsu, patron god of Lagash, had defeated Shara, patron god of Umma, using human forces as pawns in divine competition. Kings were not independent actors, but representatives of their patron deities executing divine strategy on Earth. This proxy warfare had advantages and disadvantages for the gods. It allowed them to compete without risking direct divine casualties, but it also meant victories were never final. A defeated god could rebuild their city and raise new armies, renewing the conflict. Only direct divine combat could produce decisive results, but direct combat risked catastrophic consequences if the losing side refused to accept defeat and escalated beyond conventional warfare. The texts hint at weapons of last resort, powers so destructive that using them would damage the cosmic order itself. References to the weapons with which earth and heaven were split suggest the gods possessed capabilities comparable to Marduk splitting Tiamat's body to create the world. If unleashed in anger rather than creative purpose, such weapons could unmake reality, returning cosmos to chaos. The threat of mutual assured destruction may have deterred the gods from total war, just as it would deter nuclear-armed nations millennia later. Some passages describe the Abzu, Enki's subterranean domain, as containing terrible powers kept sealed away for cosmic safety. The Mi of the underworld, controlled by Ereshkigal, included powers over death that could be weaponized. The texts suggest the gods maintained uneasy balance, partly through fear of what might happen if all restraints were abandoned and the most terrible weapons unleashed. Divine wars were fought within limits, following rules that prevented cosmic collapse even in the midst of violent conflict. Understanding these weapons and powers allows us to imagine how the final war between the Anunnaki might have unfolded. It wouldn't be a simple battle, but a complex and multi-dimensional conflict involving direct combat, proxy warfare, theft of cosmic powers, and struggles for control over the fundamental architecture of reality. The stakes would be absolute. Victory meant cosmic supremacy, defeat meant at best subordination, and at worst annihilation. The timing of this final war, based on textual analysis and archaeological evidence, appears to coincide with the great catastrophes of the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, roughly 1200 to 600 BCE. This period saw unprecedented destruction across the ancient Near East, the collapse of multiple civilizations, and fundamental reorganization of political and religious structures. While modern scholars explain these changes through natural and human causes, Mesopotamian texts contemporary with these events describe them in terms of divine warfare and cosmic crisis. The Lamentation texts, written in response to the destruction of Sumerian cities, provide our clearest textual window into what the ancient Mesopotamians perceived as the Anunnaki's final war. These liturgical poems describe gods abandoning their cities, cosmic order breaking down, terrible destruction sweeping the land. They portray this not as natural disaster or mere military defeat, but as divine catastrophe, the gods themselves fighting or withdrawing in ways that left humanity vulnerable to annihilation. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, one of the longest and most detailed of these texts, begins with Ningal, patron goddess of Ur, pleading before the divine council to spare her city. She describes Ur's piety, its faithful service to the gods, its magnificent temples and offerings. She asks what crime Ur committed to deserve destruction. The answer is chilling. The destruction was decreed not as punishment but as part of a larger divine plan, a reorganization of cosmic order that required certain cities to fall. Enlil had decided that kingship would move from Ur to Isin, that Ur's golden age had ended and a new center would rise. Ningal's protests were futile because the decision came from the highest divine authority. The text describes her tears, her grief, her sense of helplessness as she watched the fate decreed for her beloved city. She had to abandon Ur, leaving it defenseless, because she could not oppose Enlil's will. What follows is apocalyptic destruction. Foreign armies identified as the Elamites swept through Ur, burning, looting, massacring. The temples were desecrated, sacred objects stolen or smashed. The ziggurat, Ur's great pyramid temple, was damaged. Bodies filled the streets, survivors were led away as captives. The text spares no detail in describing the horror, making clear that this was not ordinary military defeat but cosmic catastrophe, the unmaking of a divinely ordained center. Other lamentation texts describe similar destructions of other Sumerian cities: Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash. Each text follows similar patterns: divine decision to abandon the city, goddess or god weeping helplessly, terrible destruction, survivors lamenting amid ruins. Taken together, these texts suggest a systematic dismantling of the Sumerian city-state system, a deliberate divine decision to end an entire civilization. Why would the gods destroy their own cities? The texts offer several explanations, none entirely satisfactory. Some suggest Enlil was angry at human sin or failure to properly maintain worship. Others blame foreign gods, invaders whose deities proved more powerful than the Sumerian pantheon. Still others describe internal divine conflict, with some gods supporting the destruction while others opposed it helplessly. The most intriguing explanation appears in texts describing the rise of Babylon and Marduk. As Babylon emerged as Mesopotamia's dominant power, its patron god Marduk claimed kingship over the entire pantheon, superseding the traditional Sumerian hierarchy. This religious revolution required subordinating older gods, particularly Enlil, who had ruled the pantheon for millennia. The destruction of the Sumerian cities and the end of their independence can be understood as manifestation of this divine power struggle. If Marduk was seizing supreme authority from Enlil, Enlil's response might have been to destroy the cities most closely tied to the old order, rather than allow them to serve the new divine king. Alternatively, Marduk might have ordered their destruction to break Enlil's power base and establish Babylon's supremacy. Either way, the archaeological and textual evidence suggests massive, coordinated destruction of Sumerian civilization at precisely the time when Babylon and Marduk were rising to dominance. This interpretation positions the final war between the Anunnaki as essentially a civil war between the old Sumerian pantheon led by Enlil and the new Babylonian order led by Marduk. The war wasn't fought primarily through direct divine combat, but through the destruction and subordination of cities, the redirection of worship and tribute, the rewriting of religious texts to glorify the victor. The human cost was catastrophic. Entire cities destroyed, populations enslaved, ancient traditions erased. But the divine cost may have been equally significant. The text suggests that after this period of destruction, the gods never again directly ruled human cities. The age of direct divine presence ended, replaced by sacred kingship where mortal rulers claimed divine appointment but clearly remained human. This withdrawal of direct divine involvement might represent the final war's most important consequence, a cosmic restructuring that separated the divine and mortal realms more definitively than ever before. Some texts describe this separation in terms of a cosmic decree, a law established by the victorious gods that prevented direct divine intervention in human affairs except through carefully regulated channels. This decree might have been intended to prevent future conflicts from devastating the mortal world, establishing something like divine non-interference as cosmic law. If the final war between the Anunnaki caused such terrible destruction that even the victorious gods recognized the need for new limits, such a decree would make sense. Evidence for this cosmic restructuring appears in the changing nature of divine-human interaction in texts from different periods. In the earliest Sumerian myths, gods walk among humans freely, personally ruling cities and engaging directly with mortals. In later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, divine appearances become rarer, more ritualized, mediated through dreams, visions, and prophetic intermediaries. By the Persian period, direct divine manifestation has almost entirely ceased, with gods acting through human agents rather than personal presence. This progressive withdrawal corresponds with the rise and fall of Mesopotamian civilizations, the destructions and reconstructions that marked the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age. If we map the timeline of divine withdrawal onto the archaeological evidence of urban destruction, we find striking correlation. The cities that fell during the Anunnaki's final war never fully recovered their former glory. New cities rose, new empires emerged, but the direct divine presence that characterized the Sumerian age was gone. The question remains, what actually happened during this final war? Beyond the metaphorical language of gods abandoning cities and divine councils decreeing destruction, what concrete events occurred? Modern archaeology provides some answers. The destruction layers in cities like Ur show evidence of massive fires, deliberate demolition of temples, and rapid abandonment. The timing of these destructions coincides with invasions by the Elamites and other peoples, but the scale of destruction exceeds normal military conquest. Some researchers have noted unusual features in these destruction layers. Vitrified stone, rock melted and fused in ways that require extremely high temperatures appears in some sites. Radiocarbon dating shows multiple cities across Mesopotamia were destroyed within a narrow time frame, suggesting coordinated attack or widespread catastrophe rather than gradual conquest. Skeletal remains show evidence of violent death, but also unusual patterns of disease and malnutrition, suggesting environmental catastrophe accompanied the military conflicts. Could the final war between the Anunnaki have involved weapons or events beyond conventional warfare? Some interpreters, particularly those in ancient astronaut theory circles, suggest nuclear weapons or other advanced technology destroyed the Sumerian cities. They point to references in texts to weapons that made terrible fire rain from the sky, or cities destroyed in single blasts. Mainstream archaeologists dismiss these interpretations as reading modern concepts into ancient metaphors, but the textual descriptions are remarkably vivid and specific in ways that merit attention. The Epic of Era, a later Babylonian text, describes the god Era causing terrible destruction through weapons that sound almost nuclear in their effects. Cities are destroyed instantly, populations annihilated, the land made uninhabitable for generations. Era, sometimes identified with the god Nergal, represents plague and pestilence, but the destruction he causes goes beyond disease to include wholesale obliteration of urban centers. The text describes survivors fleeing the destroyed cities, unable to return because the land itself had become poisonous. Whether these descriptions preserve memories of actual advanced weapons or are purely mythological is debated. What's undeniable is that something catastrophic happened to Mesopotamian civilization during this period, something the survivors understood in terms of divine warfare and cosmic crisis. The cities fell, populations declined dramatically, the political order collapsed, and the religious system underwent fundamental reorganization. Calling this the Anunnaki's final war may be mythological language, but it describes real events that transformed the ancient world. The aftermath of this war established new cosmic order. Marduk became undisputed king of the gods in Babylonian theology, though Assyria continued to assert Ashur's supremacy. The old Sumerian deities were demoted to subordinate positions or absorbed into composite deities. Enlil's authority transferred to Marduk, with Enlil becoming simply one great god among many rather than supreme ruler. Enki's role as wise counselor continued, but always subordinate to Marduk's kingship. This new divine hierarchy had terrestrial manifestations. Babylon became the undisputed center of Mesopotamian civilization, its ziggurat the most famous temple, its king claiming lordship over all other cities. The old Sumerian city-states lost their independence, becoming provincial centers of the Babylonian Empire. Religious reforms centralized worship in Babylon, with the New Year festival in Marduk's temple becoming the most important ritual event. The reorganization was total, political, religious, and cosmic. But the cost was enormous. The destruction of the Sumerian cities meant loss of libraries, temples, traditions that had existed for millennia. Much knowledge was lost forever, surviving only in Babylonian copies and translations that might have altered or misunderstood the original Sumerian texts. The cultural continuity between early Sumerian civilization and later Mesopotamian empires was broken, creating a gap that modern scholars still struggle to bridge completely. For humanity, the final war between the Anunnaki meant the end of an age. The time when gods walked among mortals was over. Humans now dealt with deities through intermediaries and rituals rather than direct encounter. This increased distance between divine and human realms had mixed consequences. It made the gods more mysterious, more awesome, but also more remote, less directly involved in human concerns. Religion became more about maintaining proper rituals and avoiding divine anger than about personal relationship with accessible deities. The separation between heaven and earth became more absolute. In the earliest myths, heaven was simply the sky above, easily reached by mountains or tall buildings. Gods descended and humans ascended without tremendous difficulty. After the final war, heaven became a separate realm, inaccessible except through death or extraordinary divine intervention. The underworld, always separate, became more firmly sealed. The cosmos was compartmentalized, with each realm having firm boundaries that were not easily crossed. This compartmentalization appears in later religious developments throughout the Near East. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all feature sharp distinctions between earthly and heavenly realms, with limited traffic between them. Angels deliver messages, demons tempt, but direct divine presence becomes rare and extraordinary. Prophets receive visions but don't casually converse with God as Abraham did. The intimacy of early religious narrative gives way to more formal, mediated relationships. These later religions inherited concepts from Mesopotamian sources. The biblical flood narrative draws directly from Mesopotamian texts. Biblical angels resemble Mesopotamian divine messengers. The war in heaven described in Revelation echoes Mesopotamian divine conflicts. The idea of cosmic warfare between good and evil forces, though given different theological framing, preserves the Mesopotamian concept of gods fighting wars with cosmic consequences. But biblical and Islamic monotheism rejected the polytheistic framework that made the Anunnaki's war possible. With only one god, divine conflict becomes impossible except as warfare between God and rebellious angels or demons. The cosmic drama shifts from conflicts between rival deities to the relationship between the one God and created beings, both human and angelic. This theological transformation made the old myths of divine warfare obsolete, though echoes persisted in stories of fallen angels and cosmic battles between good and evil. Understanding the Anunnaki's final war therefore requires understanding not just ancient Mesopotamian mythology but the broader evolution of religious thought in the ancient Near East. The war represented a climax and ending to a particular way of conceptualizing divinity, cosmic order, and divine human relations. What came after was different, shaped by the war's consequences but moving in new directions. Modern interpretations of the Anunnaki have diverged sharply from ancient sources. Popular culture, particularly ancient astronaut theory, has reimagined the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth in ancient times, genetically engineering humans and introducing advanced technology. This interpretation, popularized by writers like Zecharia Sitchin, Erich von Daniken, and others, draws selectively from Mesopotamian texts while adding speculative elements not found in the original sources. Sitchin's interpretation, laid out in his Earth Chronicles series, claims the Anunnaki came from a planet called Nibiru, in an elongated orbit through our solar system. Every 3,600 years, Nibiru passes through the inner solar system, allowing the Anunnaki to visit Earth. They supposedly came here mining gold to save their planet's atmosphere, and when their worker population rebelled, they genetically engineered humans from primitive hominids to serve as slave labor. This narrative reimagines almost every element of the Sumerian creation myths in technological rather than magical terms. The Anunnaki aren't gods but aliens with advanced technology. The creation of humans isn't divine crafting but genetic engineering. The flood wasn't divine judgment but a natural disaster the Anunnaki knew was coming. The weapons of the gods become advanced technology, perhaps nuclear weapons. The divine wars become political conflicts between alien factions. Sitchin based his interpretation on his own translations of cuneiform texts, which professional Assyriologists almost universally reject as incorrect. His reading of the word Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came is plausible, but doesn't necessarily mean extraterrestrial origin. His identification of Nibiru as a planet is disputed. with most scholars understanding Nibiru as referring to Jupiter, or a celestial crossing point rather than an undiscovered planet in eccentric orbit. Nevertheless, Sitchin's interpretation has proven enormously popular, spawning entire subcultures convinced that ancient astronaut theory explains human origins better than either evolutionary biology or traditional religious narratives. Documentaries, books, and internet content promote various versions of this theory, often mixing legitimate archaeological puzzles with wild speculation and fabricated evidence. The Anunnaki have become central to conspiracy theories linking ancient civilizations, modern governments, and supposed ongoing alien manipulation of human affairs. Academic scholars of Mesopotamian civilization reject these interpretations almost entirely. Professional translations of Sumerian and Akkadian texts show the gods as religious concepts, not extraterrestrial visitors. The creation of humanity is described in mythological rather than technological terms. The weapons and powers of the gods are portrayed as magical or divine rather than technological. Reading the texts in their original languages and cultural contexts reveals a sophisticated religious and philosophical system, not garbled accounts of alien contact. The academic consensus on the Anunnaki is that they represent the Mesopotamian conception of divinity, powerful beings who created and governed the cosmos, who are worthy of worship and capable of both benevolence and terrible destruction. The conflicts between them represented theological and political tensions within Mesopotamian society, projected onto a cosmic scale. The final war, if it represents anything historical, was the political and religious upheaval of the late Bronze Age collapse and the rise of Babylon, not literal warfare between gods or aliens. This academic understanding doesn't necessarily diminish the text's significance. Understanding ancient religious thought on its own terms reveals how Mesopotamian civilization conceptualized fundamental questions about existence, power, justice, and humanity's place in the cosmos. The sophisticated theology preserved in these texts influenced all subsequent Near Eastern religions and, through them, modern religious thought. Dismissing them as primitive superstition or misunderstood alien encounters misses their actual intellectual and spiritual depth. The scientific problems with ancient astronaut theory are numerous. The planet Nibiru, as described by Sitchin, could not exist in the orbit proposed without causing obvious gravitational disturbances to other planets, disturbances that aren't observed. The timeline of human evolution doesn't match the Anunnaki creation story, with modern humans emerging gradually over millions of years rather than appearing suddenly 300,000 years ago. The archaeological evidence shows human civilization developing organically through recognizable cultural evolution, not through sudden introduction of alien technology. Moreover, the supposed evidence for ancient advanced technology doesn't withstand scrutiny. Ancient monuments like the pyramids or Stonehenge were built using techniques we understand through experimental archaeology, without requiring lost technology or alien assistance. References to flying machines or nuclear weapons in ancient texts are better understood as mythological imagery than literal descriptions of technology. The vitrified stones, sometimes cited as evidence of ancient nuclear war, can be explained through conventional fires or meteorite impacts. Yet the enduring appeal of ancient astronaut theory suggests it addresses psychological and spiritual needs that conventional academic or religious narratives don't fully satisfy. For some people, reimagining ancient gods as aliens provides a framework that seems more compatible with modern scientific worldview than traditional religion. It preserves the sense of cosmic significance and human contact with greater than human intelligences, while avoiding the metaphysical commitments of traditional theism. This appeal extends to interpretations of the Anunnaki's final war. In ancient astronaut theory, the war becomes a conflict between alien factions, perhaps between Enlil's authoritarian faction and Enki's more liberal group, with humanity caught in the middle. The destruction of cities represents alien warfare using advanced weapons. The divine withdrawal represents the aliens leaving Earth or reducing their direct involvement. The establishment of sacred kingship represents humans being given limited self-governance under continuing alien oversight. These interpretations, while unsupported by evidence, demonstrate how ancient texts can be reinterpreted to address contemporary concerns and worldviews. Each generation reads ancient myths through its own cultural lens, finding in them reflection of current issues and anxieties. Medieval Christians read Mesopotamian myths as corrupted versions of biblical truth. Enlightenment scholars saw them as primitive superstition to be superseded by rational thought. Modern ancient astronaut theorists see them as garbled historical accounts of alien contact. Academic scholarship tries to understand the texts as products of their original cultural context, neither dismissing them as primitive nor elevating them as secret wisdom. This approach reveals the Mesopotamian texts as sophisticated theological and philosophical works addressing perennial human questions through mythological narrative. The Anunnaki weren't aliens or demons, but how ancient Mesopotamians conceptualized divine power and its relationship to human existence. The final war between the Anunnaki, understood academically, represents the theological and political transformation of Mesopotamian civilization during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. The old Sumerian religious system, with its multiplicity of city-state patron deities, gave way to more centralized systems focused on Babylon and Marduk, or Assyria and Ashur. This transition involved actual military conflicts, the destruction of cities, the reorganization of political power, and the reworking of religious narratives to legitimize the new order. Understanding this transformation enriches our grasp of how religions evolve, how theology and politics interact, and how catastrophic historical events get encoded in mythological form. The lamentation texts preserve genuine grief over destroyed cities and lost worlds. The elevation of Marduk reflects real political change. The divine withdrawal mirrors historical transition from direct theocratic rule to sacred kingship, with more bureaucratic mediation between divine and human realms. The legacy of the Anunnaki and their conflicts extends far beyond ancient Mesopotamia. The mythological patterns established in Sumerian and Babylonian texts influenced all subsequent Near Eastern religions. The cosmic warfare between divine beings, the creation of humanity from divine substance, the Great Flood, the divine council decreeing human fates, all these motifs appear in various forms throughout biblical and post-biblical literature. Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly texts like Enoch and Daniel, describes wars between angels and demons that echo Mesopotamian divine conflicts. The Book of Revelation's war in heaven, with Michael and his angels fighting the dragon, follows patterns established in the Enuma Elish and other Mesopotamian combat myths. Islamic tradition's descriptions of jinn and angels, while theologically distinct, share structural similarities with Mesopotamian hierarchies of divine and semi-divine beings. The concept of cosmic order maintained through divine kingship, central to Mesopotamian thought, influenced political theology throughout the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs, Persian kings, Hellenistic rulers, Roman emperors all claimed divine right to rule based on concepts first articulated in Mesopotamian texts. The idea that earthly kings represent cosmic order, that their rule maintains harmony between heaven and earth, stems directly from Mesopotamian religious political thought. Modern political philosophy's questioning of divine right and sacred kingship represents rejection of this Mesopotamian legacy, but the concepts themselves remain culturally influential. Appeals to cosmic justice, natural law, or transcendent moral order all carry echoes of Mesopotamian ideas about divinely ordained structure that humans should reflect in their societies. Even secular political thought often implicitly invokes these concepts while rejecting their theological framing. The Anunnaki specifically have experienced a remarkable modern revival in popular culture. Beyond ancient astronaut theory, they appear in novels, films, video games, and comic books as ancient gods, aliens, or interdimensional beings. Often these fictional portrayals mix authentic Mesopotamian mythology with speculative elements, creating hybrid narratives that bear only loose relationship to the original texts but testify to continued fascination with these ancient deities. Video games like Assassin's Creed and books like Neil Gaiman's American Gods feature Mesopotamian deities as characters, introducing millions of people to gods they might never otherwise encounter. These popular culture representations, while often historically inaccurate, create cultural literacy about ancient Mesopotamian civilization and generate interest that sometimes leads to deeper study of authentic sources. The academic study of Mesopotamian civilization continues to advance through new archaeological discoveries and refined translation methods. Every year brings new finds, additional tablets, previously unknown texts, better understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian grammar. These discoveries continually refine our understanding of what the ancient Mesopotamians believed and how they understood their gods. Recent decades have seen particular progress in understanding the economic and political functions of Mesopotamian temples. What once seemed purely religious institutions now reveal themselves as complex economic centers, managing vast agricultural estates, craft production, and trade networks. The gods weren't just objects of worship, but in practical terms, corporate entities that employed thousands of people and controlled significant percentages of each city-state's wealth and production. This economic understanding illuminates the divine conflicts in new ways. Wars between gods might represent not just theological disputes, but conflicts over economic resources and trade routes. The destruction of cities meant not just religious crisis, but economic catastrophe, the elimination of major production and trade centers. The rise of Babylon represented not just religious reformation, but economic consolidation, the emergence of a dominant market center that subordinated previously independent economic systems. Understanding Mesopotamian religion requires integrating theological, political, economic, and social perspectives. The gods weren't separate from daily life, but intimately involved in every aspect of existence. The final war between the Anunnaki was simultaneously a theological crisis, a political revolution, an economic transformation, and a social catastrophe. Reducing it to any single dimension misses the complexity of what actually occurred. Archaeological work continues in modern Iraq, though political instability has severely limited research in recent decades. The sites of ancient cities lie waiting for systematic excavation, potentially containing thousands more tablets and artifacts that could revolutionize our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization. ISIS's deliberate destruction of archaeological sites and museums during their occupation eliminated irreplaceable artifacts and records, a loss to human heritage that mirrors ancient catastrophes. Yet the clay tablets prove remarkably durable. Buried in the dry Mesopotamian soil, they survive millennia virtually unchanged. When archaeologists excavate tells, they routinely find tablets still legible after thousands of years. The very medium that preserved these texts, wedge-shaped marks impressed into clay, has proven more durable than almost any other ancient writing system. Papyrus decays, parchment deteriorates, but fired clay endures. This durability means the Anunnaki's story will likely remain available for future generations to interpret and reinterpret. Each age will bring its own perspectives, its own questions, its own methods of understanding. Future scholars may develop technologies allowing even better translation and contextualization of these ancient texts. New discoveries may overturn current consensus, revealing dimensions of Mesopotamian religion we haven't yet grasped. The question of what really happened during the Anunnaki's final war may never be fully answered. We have the lamentation texts describing destruction, the political records showing the rise of Babylon, the archaeological evidence of burned cities, and the theological texts elevating Marduk. But connecting all these pieces into a coherent historical narrative requires interpretation, and interpretation always involves uncertainty. What we can say with confidence is that something catastrophic happened to Mesopotamian civilization during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. Cities fell, populations declined, political systems collapsed, religious hierarchies were reorganized. The survivors understood these events in terms of divine warfare and cosmic restructuring. Whether their interpretation was literally true, metaphorically true, or a mythological framework imposed on natural and human disasters is perhaps less important than recognizing that real catastrophe occurred and profoundly shaped subsequent history. The enduring mystery of the Anunnaki invites contemplation about how humans understand catastrophe, power, and cosmic order. When civilizations collapse and worlds end, how do survivors make sense of what happened? The Mesopotamians turned to their gods, creating narratives that explain destruction as consequence of divine conflicts and cosmic reorganization. Modern people might explain the same events through climate change, economic systems, political failures, or social dynamics, but the underlying human need to understand catastrophe remains constant. Perhaps the Anunnaki's final war represents something universal, the end of one age and the beginning of another, the death of old certainties and the birth of new uncertainties. Every civilization eventually faces such transitions. The stable order breaks down, conflicts escalate beyond control, and when peace finally comes, the world has fundamentally changed. The gods who presided over the old order have withdrawn or been defeated, and new powers claim authority. For ancient Mesopotamia, this transition marked the end of the Sumerian age and the beginning of the Babylonian era. For humanity more broadly, it contributed to the development of religious concepts that would shape Western civilization for millennia. The idea of divine warfare, cosmic crisis, and world-ending catastrophe appears throughout religious traditions that drew on Mesopotamian sources. The apocalyptic imagination, so prevalent in modern culture, has roots in these ancient texts describing gods at war and cosmic order collapsing. Understanding the Anunnaki's final war thus becomes relevant not just for historical knowledge, but for understanding how humans conceptualize crisis, change, and the end of worlds. In an age when climate change, nuclear weapons, and other catastrophic threats loom large in collective consciousness, the ancient myths of divine warfare and cosmic destruction resonate with contemporary anxiety. Perhaps we're not so different from the Mesopotamians, who looked at destroyed cities and broken order, searching for explanations and hoping for renewal. The texts themselves remain, preserved across millennia, offering their testimony. They speak of gods who walked among mortals, who created humanity and fought wars that reshaped creation. They tell of conflicts between divine brothers, of cosmic weapons and existential stakes, of cities destroyed and people scattered. They record lamentation and grief, the mourning for lost worlds and vanished gods. They document the transition from one age to another, from direct divine presence to divine withdrawal, from multiplicity to emerging monotheism. Whether we interpret these texts as religious truth, historical allegory, or ancient fiction, they preserve something essential about human experience: the struggle to understand power beyond human control, the search for meaning in catastrophe, the effort to find order in chaos. The Anunnaki's final war, whatever it was historically, mythologically, or theologically, represents this perennial human struggle writ large across cosmic canvas. As we conclude this exploration, we're left with more questions than answers. Did the war literally happen as described in the texts? Were there actual divine beings fighting for cosmic supremacy? Or does the mythology preserve garbled memories of human conflicts, natural disasters, and social transformations? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between literal reading and pure metaphor, in a space where historical events, theological interpretation, and mythological imagination interweave inseparably. The clay tablets remain silent on these meta-questions. They simply tell their stories, describe their gods, record their catastrophes. They invite us to engage with an ancient worldview radically different from modern perspectives, yet addressing concerns that remain surprisingly contemporary. Power, justice, mortality, meaning, purpose, all the great questions humanity has always asked find expression in these ancient texts about gods at war and worlds in transition. So we return to where we began, to clay tablets inscribed with wedge-shaped marks, to stories from the dawn of literate civilization, to the Anunnaki and their final war. These gods who descended from heaven, who created humanity, who fought among themselves until cosmic order itself was reshaped. Their story, preserved across millennia, continues to fascinate and disturb, challenge and inspire. It reminds us that every age ends, every order eventually falls, and from the ruins something new emerges, shaped by catastrophe but carrying forward elements of what came before. The Sumerian civilization that first recorded these stories has long vanished. Their cities are tells in the desert, their people lost to history, their language a dead tongue studied by specialists. But their stories survive, testimony to human creativity and the enduring power of myth to capture truth that history alone cannot fully express. The Anunnaki's final war was the end of their world, but the beginning of legacies that continue shaping human thought and culture today. In our own age of transition and uncertainty, as old orders crack and new ones struggle to emerge, perhaps we can find something useful in these ancient texts. Not literal blueprints for understanding current events, but metaphors and frameworks for thinking about change, conflict, and cosmic order. The gods may have withdrawn, the old certainties may have collapsed, but humanity endures, still asking the same fundamental questions, still creating narratives to make sense of chaos. The Anunnaki's war reminds us that catastrophe can be survived, that from destruction new creation emerges, that the end of one age makes possible the beginning of another. It reminds us, too, that we should build with humility, knowing that all our grandest creations will eventually crumble. All our certainties will eventually be questioned. All our orders will eventually give way to new configurations of power and meaning. The transformation of Mesopotamian religious thought after the Anunnaki's final war extended beyond theological reorganization to fundamental changes in how humans understood their relationship with the divine. Before the war, the boundary between divine and human was permeable. Heroes could achieve a divine status, gods could father human children, and the king list recorded rulers who were partly divine. After the war, this permeability decreased dramatically. Humans remained firmly mortal, separated from divinity by an unbridgeable gap except through death. This separation manifests in changes to burial practices and afterlife concepts. In earlier Sumerian thought, the afterlife was democratic but grim. All people, regardless of status or virtue, descended to the dark underworld where they existed as shades in eternal twilight. Kings and slaves shared the same fate, though kings might have slightly better accommodations. This changed after the final war, with increasing emphasis on proper burial, grave goods, and rituals meant to ensure comfortable existence in the afterlife. The dead became more firmly separated from the living, confined to their realm as the gods were confined to theirs. The proliferation of intermediary beings also increased after the war. Angels, demons, and lesser spirits filled the gap between remote gods and earthbound humans. These intermediaries could interact with mortals more freely than the great gods, delivering messages, causing mischief, or providing protection. The developed angelology and demonology visible in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions drew heavily from this Mesopotamian expansion of intermediary beings. Demons in Mesopotamian thought were not necessarily evil in the moral sense, but represented chaotic or destructive forces that existed outside proper cosmic order. The Lilitu, female demons that preyed on children and men, became the biblical Lilith. The Rabisu, demons that lurked in doorways, required protective amulets and incantations to ward off. Pazuzu, the demon of the southwest wind, brought fever and plague but could also protect against even worse demons. The elaborate demon hierarchies developed in post-war Mesopotamian religion influenced all subsequent demonologies and Near Eastern traditions. Protective magic and ritual became increasingly important in this new religious landscape. If the great gods were remote and intermediary spirits were dangerous, humans needed tools to navigate the supernatural realms safely. Mesopotamian magic developed sophisticated systems of amulets, incantations, and rituals designed to compel spiritual forces, protect against malevolent entities, and ensure divine favor. The magical papyri, spellbooks, and ritual instructions that survive show how central magic became to Mesopotamian religious life. This magical worldview recognized that reality operated according to cosmic laws that could be understood and manipulated through correct techniques. Words of power, properly spoken, could command reality itself. Rituals correctly performed created effects in the spiritual realm that manifested physically. Knowing the true name of a spirit granted power over it. These magical principles developed in Mesopotamia spread throughout the ancient world and continue influencing magical traditions today. The priesthood underwent significant reorganization after the final war. Where earlier priests had been relatively simple temple servants feeding the gods and maintaining shrines, the post-war priesthood became a complex hierarchy of specialized roles. There were priests who performed daily rituals, priests who specialized in divination, priests who handled purification ceremonies, priests who conducted exorcisms, priests who managed temple property, and priests who studied and copied sacred texts. This professionalization of religious practice created a barrier between ordinary people and direct access to the divine. Where earlier Mesopotamians might approach their gods relatively directly through personal prayers and small offerings, the developed temple system required expert intermediation. Only properly trained priests could perform the complex rituals necessary to maintain cosmic order and ensure divine favor. This centralization of religious authority and professional priesthood set patterns that would continue through later religious traditions. The scribal schools attached to temples became centers of learning where young men, usually from privileged families, spent years mastering cuneiform writing, mathematics, literature, and religious texts. These schools produced the bureaucrats and administrators who ran temple estates and royal governments, creating a literate elite whose power derived from their specialized knowledge. The curriculum included copying ancient texts, ensuring the preservation and transmission of Mesopotamian literary and religious traditions across generations. Among the texts copied and studied were the stories of the Anunnaki and their wars. These weren't just entertainment but sacred history, explaining how the current cosmic order came into being and why things were the way they were. Students memorized passages, learned the proper spelling of divine names, and studied the philosophical and theological implications of the myths. Through this educational system, the memory of the final war between the Anunnaki was preserved and transmitted, even as its historical reality faded into legendary past. The physical architecture of temples evolved to reflect the new cosmic order. Earlier Sumerian temples had been relatively simple structures, houses for the gods with storage rooms for offerings. Post-war temples became massive complexes with elaborate entrance rituals, multiple courtyards each requiring different levels of purity to access, and inner sanctums where only the highest priests could enter. The spatial organization mirrored cosmic hierarchy, with movement from outer to inner courts representing ascent from human to divine realms. Ziggurats, the stepped pyramid temples, reached their most developed forms after the final war. These artificial mountains, connecting earth and heaven, became the most distinctive feature of Mesopotamian religious architecture. The ziggurat at Babylon, the Anunnaki, was the largest and most famous, supposedly standing over 300 feet tall. Its 7 stages, painted in different colors, represented the cosmic spheres, with the blue shrine at the summit housing Marduk's statue and serving as the meeting point between heaven and earth. The ziggurat's function remains debated among scholars. Some interpret it as a stairway for the gods to descend, others as a cosmic mountain echoing the primordial mound of creation, still others as a place where priests conducted astronomical observations. Likely it served multiple functions simultaneously, operating within a religious worldview that didn't sharply distinguish between symbolic and practical purposes. The ziggurat was simultaneously sacred architecture, cosmic model, astronomical observatory, and political statement of the city's wealth and divine favor. Festivals and ritual calendars became increasingly elaborate in the post-war period. The Mesopotamian year was structured around religious festivals celebrating various gods and cosmic events. The New Year festival, the Akitu, was the most important, involving 11 days of rituals reenacting the creation of the world, the crowning of the king, and the affirmation of cosmic order. During the festival, the Enuma Elish was recited, reminding participants of Marduk's victory over Tiamat and his establishment of cosmic kingship. The Akitu festival included remarkable rituals of royal humiliation and renewal. The king was stripped of his regalia, slapped by the high priest, and forced to declare his innocence of wrongdoing before Marduk's statue. Only after this humiliation was he reinstated with his crown and symbols of office, symbolically dying and being reborn, his authority renewed for another year. This ritual demonstrated that even the king's power derived from the gods and required constant renewal through proper worship and conduct. Other festivals celebrated specific deities or seasonal events. The sacred marriage ritual reenacted the sexual union of gods, performed by the king and a priestess representing the divine couple, supposedly ensuring fertility for the coming year. Modern scholars debate whether this ritual was enacted literally or symbolically, with some arguing for actual sexual intercourse, and others suggesting purely symbolic performance. The texts are ambiguous, perhaps deliberately so, leaving room for interpretations that shifted across times and places. Harvest festivals, planting festivals, and festivals marking significant astronomical events filled the calendar. Each required specific rituals, offerings, and sometimes processions, where divine statues were carried through the streets, allowing the gods to inspect their cities and receive the adulation of their people. These public religious events reinforced social cohesion, reminded everyone of their place in cosmic and social hierarchies, and provided breaks from the ordinary routine of agricultural labor and urban life. The economic impact of this elaborate religious system was enormous. Temples owned vast estates, employed thousands of workers, and consumed significant portions of agricultural production through offerings and priestly consumption. Some estimates suggest temples controlled 30 to 40% of the economy in major Mesopotamian cities. This created both stability, through redistributive functions that helped feed the population during famines, and tension, as temple wealth and power sometimes competed with royal authority. Kings attempted various strategies to manage their relationship with the powerful temple establishments. Some emphasized their role as chief servants of the gods, subordinating themselves to religious authority. Others asserted royal supremacy, claiming direct divine appointment that superseded priestly mediation. The most successful kings balanced both approaches, honoring the gods and enriching temples while maintaining ultimate political control and using religious authority to legitimize their rule. The legal codes promulgated by Mesopotamian kings demonstrate this integration of religious and political authority. The Code of Hammurabi, the most famous, begins with Hammurabi claiming the gods appointed him to bring justice to the land. The laws themselves mix religious obligations, civil regulations, and criminal penalties without clear distinction between secular and sacred law. Justice was understood as reflection of divine order, with the king serving as agent of the god's will in establishing fair dealings among humans. Property law, contract law, marriage law, inheritance law, all received detailed treatment in these legal codes. Reading them reveals a complex society with sophisticated economic systems, diverse family structures, and elaborate social hierarchies. Slaves, free commoners, and aristocrats had different legal standings and penalties. Women's rights varied by social class, with some provisions protecting their interests, while others subordinated them to male relatives. The codes provide invaluable windows into how Mesopotamian society actually functioned beneath the theological superstructure. Trade and commerce connected Mesopotamian cities to distant regions, creating networks of exchange that spread cultural and religious ideas along with goods. Merchants travelled to Anatolia for metals, to the Indus Valley for precious stones, to the Persian Gulf for pearls, and to the Levant for timber. These trading expeditions required divine protection, with merchants making offerings before departure and after safe return, attributing their success or failure to divine favour or disfavour. The spread of cuneiform writing beyond Mesopotamia proper demonstrates cultural influence extending with trade. Hittites, Egyptians, and other peoples adopted cuneiform for diplomatic correspondence and record-keeping. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and Near Eastern rulers, were written in Akkadian using cuneiform, showing that Mesopotamian civilization set standards for international communication. This cultural influence meant that ideas about the Anunnaki and Mesopotamian religion spread far beyond their original homeland. Yet we must acknowledge what was lost during the catastrophes of the final war and subsequent conflicts. Every destroyed library, every burned tablet collection, every city abandoned and buried represents knowledge gone forever. We have fragments of the Sumerian literary tradition, not the complete corpus. Many texts survive in single copies or multiple damaged copies that must be painstakingly reconstructed. The gaps in our knowledge are vast, and we can only speculate about what once existed but is now lost. Modern Assyriologists estimate that we've recovered perhaps 10% of the cuneiform literature that once existed. The rest is gone, destroyed by fire, flood, deliberate iconoclasm, or simply buried and never excavated. Each new excavation brings hope of finding lost masterpieces, complete copies of fragmentary texts, or entirely unknown works. The discovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh in the 19th century revolutionized understanding of ancient literature. What other masterpieces might still lie buried beneath Iraqi tells? The ongoing instability in Iraq makes systematic archaeology difficult or impossible in many regions. Archaeological sites have been looted, museums ransacked, artifacts sold on black markets or destroyed by religious extremists who saw them as pagan idols. The loss is incalculable, not just for academic understanding of Mesopotamian civilization, but for human heritage generally. These artifacts belong to everyone, testament to human creativity and civilization's earliest achievements, now gone forever. International efforts to preserve and protect Mesopotamian cultural heritage have had mixed success. Some important sites receive protection and careful excavation, but many remain vulnerable. The digitization of museum collections and archaeological records at least preserves knowledge of objects even if the physical artifacts are lost. But digital records cannot replace the irreplaceable, the actual clay tablets shaped by ancient hands and inscribed with the world's first written literature. Climate change poses additional threats to Mesopotamian archaeology. Rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and increasing salinity from irrigation have damaged sites that survived millennia of previous environmental changes. Some tells are eroding, others suffering from salt crystallization that destroys buried materials. Without intervention, some sites may be lost before they can be excavated, their contents destroyed by environmental degradation rather than human violence. Against these losses stands the remarkable durability of what has survived. Clay tablets, buried in the dry Mesopotamian soil, remain legible after 4,000 years. The words inscribed by ancient scribes can still be read. The stories they preserved can still move us. The Anunnaki still speak through these texts, telling their stories of creation, conflict, and cosmic order. Though civilizations fell and gods were forgotten, the words survived, testament to the power of written language to preserve and transmit across vast gulfs of time. This preservation allows modern people to engage directly with ancient thought in ways impossible for civilizations without writing. We can read Gilgamesh's lament for mortality, feel Ningal's grief over destroyed Ur, follow Marduk's battle against chaos, understand Enki's clever protection of humanity. These aren't abstract historical facts, but vivid narratives that communicate human experience across millennia. The emotional and intellectual content remains accessible, allowing genuine connection with people dead for thousands of years. The study of Mesopotamian civilization therefore serves multiple purposes. Academically, it illuminates the foundations of Near Eastern civilization, the origins of writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. Religiously, it reveals the sources from which later traditions drew inspiration and concepts. Philosophically, it demonstrates alternative ways of understanding divinity, cosmos, justice, and human purpose. Culturally, it reminds us that civilization is both durable and fragile, capable of remarkable achievements, but always vulnerable to catastrophic collapse. The Anunnaki's final war encapsulates all these dimensions. As historical event, it marks the transition from Sumerian to Babylonian dominance. As religious narrative, it explains theological reorganization and the withdrawal of direct divine presence. As philosophical reflection, it explores questions of power, justice, and cosmic order. As cultural memory, it preserves trauma and transformation across generations. Understanding it fully requires integrating all these perspectives, recognizing that ancient texts operate simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning. Perhaps most significantly, the final war reminds us that change, even catastrophic change, is not the end but transformation. The Sumerian world ended, but Mesopotamian civilization continued in new forms. The gods changed but remained, adapted to new theological frameworks while retaining core characteristics. Humanity survived despite the destruction, rebuilt cities, and maintained cultural continuity even as political and religious structures shifted fundamentally. This resilience, this capacity to endure catastrophe and rebuild, characterizes human civilization generally. Every culture eventually faces its apocalypse, its final war, its end of the world. Some civilizations vanish completely, but more often transformation occurs. Elements of the old persist in the new, adapted and reconfigured but maintaining a connection with the past. The Mesopotamian religious tradition, though the old gods are no longer worshipped, lives on in concepts and narratives that shaped Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Tracing these influences illuminates how religious ideas evolve and spread. The biblical flood story clearly derives from Mesopotamian sources, likely transmitted during the Babylonian exile when Jewish elites lived in Babylon and encountered Mesopotamian literature directly. The concept of divine councils, where God consults with angels before important decisions, echoes the Mesopotamian assembly of the gods. The war in heaven between Michael and Satan parallels the wars between Mesopotamian deities. These aren't coincidental similarities, but actual cultural transmission of religious concepts. Islamic tradition preserves different elements of Mesopotamian heritage. The jinn, spiritual beings made from smokeless fire, occupy a similar conceptual space to Mesopotamian demons and lesser deities. The emphasis on correct ritual performance to ensure divine favor echoes Mesopotamian religious practice. The cosmological structure with multiple heavens derives partly from Mesopotamian cosmic geography. These influences came through multiple channels: Jewish and Christian intermediaries, direct preservation in Arabic-speaking regions, and syncretism with pre-Islamic Arabian religion that itself had been influenced by Mesopotamian culture. The modern revival of interest in ancient Mesopotamian religion, whether through serious academic study or popular culture fascination, represents another transformation. The gods who were forgotten for centuries now experience renewed attention, though the nature of that attention differs dramatically from ancient worship. No one builds temples to Marduk or offers sacrifices to Inanna, but millions learn their stories through video games, novels, and internet research. This cultural presence without religious practice creates a peculiar afterlife for ancient deities, remembered but not believed, studied but not worshipped. The exception to this generalization is small neo-pagan movements attempting to revive ancient Mesopotamian religion. These groups, though numerically insignificant, demonstrate that some people find value in ancient religious forms beyond historical interest. Whether such revivals constitute genuine continuity with ancient tradition or represent modern reconstructions using ancient names is debatable. The cultural context has changed so thoroughly that recreating ancient religious experience may be impossible, even with sincere effort. More significant is the scholarly enterprise of understanding Mesopotamian religion on its own terms, rather than through later theological frameworks. Early Assyriologists, often trained as Christian clergy, approached cuneiform texts as background to biblical studies. Modern scholars increasingly study Mesopotamian civilization for its own sake, as a complex culture worthy of attention independent of its influence on later traditions. This shift allows clearer understanding of what ancient Mesopotamians actually believed, rather than how their beliefs prefigured later religions. This scholarly work reveals Mesopotamian religion as sophisticated, internally consistent, and philosophically rich. The concepts of cosmic order maintained through ritual, divine kingship legitimizing earthly rule, humanity created to serve divine purposes, all represent coherent responses to fundamental questions about existence, purpose, and social organization. The Mesopotamians weren't primitive people with confused ideas about reality, but thoughtful individuals developing comprehensive worldviews within their cultural and technological limitations. Their answers differ from modern answers, but the questions remain remarkably similar. Why does evil exist? How should society be organized? What gives authority its legitimacy? What happens after death? What is humanity's purpose? These perennial questions received Mesopotamian answers involving divine will, cosmic order, sacred kingship, and ritual maintenance of creation. Modern answers invoke different frameworks, natural law, democracy, individual rights, but address the same fundamental concerns. Understanding this continuity of human questioning across millennia provides perspective on our own era. We face challenges the Mesopotamians could never have imagined: technological, environmental, social, yet we're still fundamentally human, still asking the same questions about meaning, purpose, and how to live well. Their answers, preserved in cuneiform on clay tablets, remind us that humans have always struggled with these issues and found various solutions. None perfect, but all reflecting genuine attempts to understand existence and create meaningful order. The Anunnaki's final war represents one culture's understanding of catastrophic change and transformation. Their specific interpretation involved divine conflict, cosmic restructuring, and the end of an age. Our interpretations of comparable events use different vocabularies, political, economic, social, but describe similar experiences of order collapsing and new arrangements emerging from chaos. The emotional content remains recognizable across the cultural divide. Grief for lost worlds, anxiety about uncertain futures, hope that something better might emerge from destruction. As we conclude this exploration of the Anunnaki and their final war, we return to the fundamental questions this investigation raises. Did these events literally occur as the texts describe? Were there actual divine beings fighting for cosmic supremacy? Or does the mythology preserve displaced memories of human conflicts and natural catastrophes? The evidence allows multiple interpretations, and perhaps the ambiguity itself is meaningful, suggesting that truth operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Historically, something catastrophic clearly happened to Mesopotamian civilization during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. Cities were destroyed, populations declined, political systems collapsed, religious hierarchies were reorganized. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous on these points. How we interpret these events, whether as divine warfare or purely human and natural causes, depends on metaphysical commitments that extend beyond empirical evidence. Theologically, the texts preserve sophisticated reflections on divine nature, cosmic order, and divine human relations. Whether we believe in the Anunnaki as actual deities or understand them as cultural constructs, the theological concepts they embody remain intellectually interesting and historically influential. The questions these myths explore, questions about power, justice, suffering, and purpose, remain relevant regardless of the god's ontological status. Mythologically, the stories of the Anunnaki demonstrate the power of narrative to preserve and transmit cultural memory across generations. The final war, real or legendary, became foundational mythology explaining why the world was the way it was. Later generations told and retold these stories, finding in them meaning that addressed their own concerns and questions. The myths were alive, constantly reinterpreted, never fixed in single authoritative versions, but fluid and responsive to changing contexts. Culturally, the Mesopotamian achievement represented by these texts deserves recognition and appreciation independent of theological commitments. The fact that humans 6,000 years ago could create sophisticated literature, complex theology, and elaborate civilizations challenges assumptions about linear progress and primitive antiquity. The Mesopotamians weren't primitive precursors to modern sophistication, but sophisticated people creating remarkable civilizations with the tools and knowledge available to them. The enduring legacy of the Anunnaki reminds us that civilizations rise and fall, gods come and go, but human creativity and the search for meaning persist across all of transformations. The clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform marks testify to this persistence, still readable after millennia, still capable of moving and challenging those who engage with them seriously. These texts are bridges connecting us to the ancient world, allowing genuine encounter with people long dead but still speaking through the words they've preserved. What can we learn from the Anunnaki's final war? Perhaps that catastrophe can be survived, that from destruction new creation emerges, that the end of one age makes possible the beginning of another. Perhaps that our grandest creations will eventually crumble, our certainties will eventually be questioned, our orders will eventually give way to new configurations. Perhaps that the divine, however we understand it, operates beyond our complete comprehension, mysterious and awesome. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler, that humans have always faced catastrophes, always struggled to understand cosmic order, always created narratives to make sense of chaos. The Anunnaki's war is our war, the perennial human struggle against disorder and meaninglessness, the constant effort to create and maintain civilization against entropic forces that threaten to overwhelm it. Their success and failure, their triumph and tragedy, mirror our own across the gulf of millennia. The archaeological record continues to yield new discoveries that refine our understanding of what actually occurred during the period of the final war. Excavations at sites like Tel Brak, Nippur, and other Mesopotamian cities have revealed destruction layers dating to the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, precisely when the textual sources describe divine abandonment and catastrophic conflicts. These destruction layers show evidence of massive fires, deliberate demolition of temples and palaces, and rapid abandonment of previously thriving urban centres. What caused these destructions remains debated. Climate records show significant environmental changes during this period, with drought conditions affecting large regions of the Near East. The collapse of centralized irrigation systems, which required constant maintenance and political stability to function, would have caused agricultural failures and famine. These natural disasters would have intensified political instability, making cities vulnerable to invasion by nomadic groups or rival city-states. The combination of environmental, political, and military crises created perfect conditions for civilizational collapse. Yet the survivors of these catastrophes understood them primarily through religious frameworks. The lamentation texts don't discuss drought or political instability, but divine anger and cosmic disorder. This difference between modern anti-Nisolitical frameworks and ancient interpretive frameworks is crucial to understand. We seek material causes, environmental and political factors. The Mesopotamians sought spiritual causes, divine decisions, and supernatural conflicts. Neither framework is necessarily wrong. They simply operate at different levels of analysis, answering different types of questions. The integration of these frameworks allows richer understanding than either alone could provide. Material conditions created the context in which catastrophe became possible, but cultural and religious responses determined how people experienced and remembered those catastrophes. The drought was real, the invasions were real, the destroyed cities were real, but the meaning attributed to these events shaped how survivors rebuilt and what lessons they drew from disaster. The decision to reorganize the religious hierarchy around Marduk and Babylon reflected political realities but also theological convictions about cosmic order. This interplay between material conditions and cultural interpretation continues throughout human history. Every civilization experiencing catastrophe must make sense of what happened and decide how to respond. The frameworks used for this sense-making profoundly affect subsequent development. Mesopotamian civilization, interpreting catastrophe as divine warfare and cosmic restructuring, responded by reorganizing religious hierarchies, rebuilding cities, and preserving cultural continuity through carefully copied texts. Other civilizations facing comparable challenges made different choices based on different interpretive frameworks, leading to divergent historical trajectories. The specificity of Mesopotamian responses to the final war period shaped not just their own subsequent history, but influenced all later Near Eastern civilizations. The religious concepts developed during and after this period, divine kingship, cosmic warfare, apocalyptic transformation, spread throughout the region and eventually influenced religious traditions extending far beyond the ancient Near East. Understanding the Mesopotamian source of these concepts illuminates their meaning and function in later contexts. Consider the concept of divine kingship, which became central to Mesopotamian political theology after the final war. The king was understood as mediator between divine and human realms, appointed by the gods to maintain cosmic order on Earth. His proper performance of rituals ensured fertility, prosperity, and divine protection for the realm. His failure in these responsibilities could trigger divine punishment affecting the entire population. This theological framework justified centralized political authority while simultaneously limiting it through religious obligation. Later civilizations adopted and adapted this concept. Egyptian pharaohs claimed divine status more completely than Mesopotamian kings, understanding themselves as actual gods incarnate rather than mere divine appointees. Persian emperors claimed divine favor and cosmic mandate for their universal rule. Hellenistic rulers after Alexander combined Greek and Near Eastern concepts to create ruler cults that worshipped kings as divine or semi-divine beings. Roman emperors built on these precedents to establish emperor worship as unifying ideology for their vast empire. Biblical tradition responded to divine kingship differently, accepting that earthly kings ruled by divine appointment, but insisting on their fundamental mortality and accountability to divine law. The prophets repeatedly challenged kings, who claimed authority while violating justice, asserting that divine favor required righteousness, not just proper ritual. This tension between political authority and religious obligation, rooted in Mesopotamian precedents but developed in distinctive directions, shaped Jewish and Christian political thought profoundly. Islamic concepts of the Caliphate, the successor to the Prophet as leader of the Muslim community, similarly drew on ancient Near Eastern models of religiously legitimized political authority while adapting them to monotheistic theology. The Caliph, unlike the Mesopotamian king, was not divine or semi-divine, but represented divine will in governing the community. This modified form of sacred kingship, stripped of polytheistic elements but retaining the core concept of religiously authorized political leadership, demonstrates how ancient patterns persist through theological transformation. The concept of apocalypse, understood as catastrophic divine intervention that ends one age and inaugurates another, likewise traces to Mesopotamian sources and the experience of the final war period. The destruction of the Sumerian cities and the end of direct divine rule constituted an apocalyptic transition for those who experienced it. Later apocalyptic literature in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions elaborated on these Mesopotamian precedents, developing elaborate visions of end times, final battles between cosmic forces, and divine judgment establishing new orders. The Book of Daniel, written during the Hellenistic period, presents visions of empires rising and falling according to divine plan, culminating in divine intervention establishing eternal kingdom. The Book of Revelation, with its vivid imagery of cosmic warfare, judgment, and new creation, draws heavily on ancient Near Eastern mythological patterns while reframing them in Christian theological terms. Islamic eschatology, describing the Day of Judgment and the final triumph of divine justice, similarly adapts ancient patterns to monotheistic framework. These apocalyptic traditions serve similar functions to the Mesopotamian texts describing the Anunnaki's final war. They make sense of catastrophe by placing it within cosmic narrative of divine purpose. They offer hope that current suffering will be resolved through dramatic divine intervention. They provide interpretive frameworks for understanding political and social crises as meaningful rather than random. They preserve memory of past catastrophes while projecting similar patterns onto future expected transformations. The psychological and social functions of apocalyptic narrative deserve recognition. When people experience catastrophe that destroys familiar order, apocalyptic frameworks allow them to understand that destruction is meaningful transition rather than meaningless chaos. The old order was corrupt or exhausted. Divine intervention sweeps it away and a new order will emerge purified and renewed. This narrative pattern provides comfort and direction during periods of radical uncertainty and change. Modern secular apocalyptic narratives, though framed in scientific or political rather than religious language, follow remarkably similar patterns. Predictions of climate catastrophe, nuclear war, or civilizational collapse that will destroy current order and necessitate radical transformation echo ancient apocalyptic structures. The hope that catastrophe will somehow lead to better world, whether through forcing recognition of environmental limits or triggering revolutionary social transformation, mirrors the religious hope that divine judgment will establish justice and righteousness. These parallels suggest that apocalyptic thinking addresses deep human psychological needs that transcend specific religious or cultural frameworks. When faced with overwhelming challenges and the possibility that familiar order might collapse, the apocalyptic narrative provides structure for anxiety and hope for meaningful resolution. The Mesopotamian experience of the Anunnaki's final war established patterns that continue resonating because they address perennial human concerns about catastrophe, meaning, and transformation. Understanding these patterns doesn't require believing that gods literally fought wars or that divine intervention will solve contemporary crises. Rather, it illuminates how humans construct meaning in the face of potential catastrophe and how narrative frameworks shape responses to overwhelming challenges. The Mesopotamians faced genuine catastrophes and developed narratives that helped them survive psychologically while rebuilding physically. Later cultures facing their own catastrophes adapted those narrative patterns to their contexts. We today, facing our own potential catastrophes, can learn from these historical examples while developing our own responses. The question of whether the Anunnaki actually existed and fought their final war ultimately matters less than understanding how belief in that war functioned culturally and psychologically. For the ancient Mesopotamians, it was absolutely real, perhaps the most significant event in cosmic history. For us, It represents cultural memory preserved in mythological form, combining historical events with theological interpretation and literary elaboration in ways that cannot be fully disentangled. This ambiguity itself may be instructive. History, theology, and mythology are not clearly separable categories in ancient sources the way modern academic disciplines are. The texts describe events that actually occurred, destruction of cities and reorganization of political hierarchies, while simultaneously interpreting those events through religious frameworks involving divine beings whose existence cannot be empirically verified. Modern historians extract the verifiable historical data while bracketing theological claims, but this separation would have made no sense to ancient authors for whom historical events and divine actions were inseparable. Recognizing this different epistemological framework helps us understand ancient sources more accurately. When the lamentation over the destruction of Ur describes Ningal weeping over her destroyed city, modern readers must decide whether to read this as poetic metaphor, theological interpretation, or literal description of divine grief. Ancient audiences likely didn't make such sharp distinctions, experiencing the text simultaneously as emotional expression, theological explanation, and historical witness. The goddess wept because the city fell, and the city fell because the goddess's divine protection was withdrawn, and both statements were simply true from ancient perspectives. This integrated ancient worldview contrasts sharply with modern fragmentation of knowledge into separate disciplines and categories. Science explains material causes, religion addresses spiritual meanings, history documents events, literature explores emotional truth, and philosophy interrogates underlying assumptions. Ancient Mesopotamian thought didn't separate these domains so neatly. A single text could simultaneously record historical events, explain their theological significance, explore their emotional impact, and raise philosophical questions about justice and cosmic order. Perhaps recovering something of this integrated approach could enrich modern understanding, not by abandoning disciplinary rigor or empirical standards, but by recognizing that reality is complex and multi-layered, requiring multiple frameworks and perspectives for adequate comprehension. The Anunnaki's final war, understood historically, theologically, psychologically, and literarily, becomes richer and more meaningful than any single analytical framework could reveal. This multidimensional understanding honors both the ancient sources and modern interpretive capabilities. As we close this exploration, several themes emerge as particularly significant. First, the persistence of cultural memory across vast spans of time. The clay tablets preserve stories from 6,000 years ago, still capable of moving and challenging modern readers. This demonstrates the power of written language to transcend temporal and cultural boundaries, creating genuine connection across millennia. Second, the universality of human concerns about meaning, purpose, and cosmic order. The specific answers provided by Mesopotamian religion differ from modern responses, but the underlying questions remain remarkably constant. How should we understand catastrophe? What legitimizes authority? What happens after death? Why does suffering exist? These perennial questions unite humanity across all cultural and temporal differences. Third, the resilience of human civilization in the face of catastrophe. The Sumerian cities fell, the old order collapsed, but Mesopotamian civilization continued in new forms. Babylon rose from the ruins, preserving and adapting earlier traditions, while creating its own distinctive contributions. This pattern of destruction and renewal, catastrophe and recovery, characterizes human history generally. Fourth, the profound influence of ancient Mesopotamian civilization on all subsequent Near Eastern and Western cultures. Religious concepts, political ideas, literary forms, and philosophical frameworks developed in Mesopotamia spread throughout the ancient world and continue shaping thought today, often in ways we don't fully recognize, because they have become so thoroughly integrated into cultural assumptions we take for granted. Finally, the enduring mystery at the heart of these ancient texts. Despite centuries of scholarly study, translation, and interpretation, the Anunnaki and their final war retain elements of irreducible mystery. We can analyze the texts, examine the archaeology, trace the influences, but something essential remains elusive, resistant to complete rational explanation. Perhaps this mystery itself is meaningful, reminding us that not everything can or should be fully rationalized and explained. The text remains silent clay tablets waiting to be read. They preserve stories that have survived the destruction of the civilization that created them, outlasted the gods they celebrate, and speak still to people in a world unimaginably different from ancient Mesopotamia. This survival itself is remarkable, testament to the durability of written language and the enduring human hunger for stories that explain our world and our place in it. As you've journeyed with me through the ancient texts and the catastrophic events they describe, I hope you found something valuable, whether historical knowledge, philosophical insight, or simply appreciation for the richness of human mythological imagination. These stories from humanity's first civilization continue to speak across millennia, testament to the enduring power of narrative to capture and transmit meaning across vast chasms of time and cultural change. The Anunnaki may have withdrawn from the earth, the old gods may no longer receive worship, the great cities may lie buried beneath desert sands, but the memory remains. Preserved in clay, transmitted through texts, studied by scholars, popularized in culture, the story of the final war between the Anunnaki continues to evolve and find new audiences. Each generation brings its own interpretations, its own questions, its own needs that these ancient narratives somehow address. So take a moment now to like this video if you found it worthwhile, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these deep dives into history, mythology, and the mysteries of ancient civilizations. Let me know in the comments what aspects of the Anunnaki's story most fascinated or surprised you, and what other topics from ancient Mesopotamia you'd like me to explore in future videos. The ancient world holds countless stories still waiting to be told, countless mysteries still inviting investigation, countless lessons still relevant to our modern lives. Until next time, may you find meaning in the stories of the past and wisdom for navigating the uncertainties of the present.